Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Roboutian Heresy in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Interlude, a ghostly warning. Verifying access codes. Access codes confirmed. Verifying clearance level. Clearance level confirmed. Subject, Inquisitor Yekaterina Salem. Location, Baal System, Facility 99 Alpha, Mausoleum of the Faithful. Timestamp, 362nd day, year 999.m41. Initializing recorded self-stream. Beginning actualization of record. Synchronization validated. Start of recording. The Emperor sees all. The Emperor knows all. The mausoleum was a place of shadows, lit only by the dim glow of emergency lumens and the flickering light of stasis fields. In her left hand, Yekaterina held a lantern, fashioned from the bones of imperial servants who had died in the pursuit of their duties to the Inquisition, and glass made from the melted sands of Prospero. The flame that burned inside the lantern had been taken from the eternal flame that burned within the hallowed temple of Dimamar, where the memory of Sebastian Thor was honored by the people of his home world. The lantern was a relic, a gift from Yekaterina's master, who himself had received it from his own mistress, and so on, all the way back to the early days of the Holy Ordos. Pieces of the lantern had been replaced over time, of course, and the flame that burned inside had gone out and needed to be renewed, but the lantern had retained the blessing and properties that made it useful. As long as one carried it into the dark places, the light that shone from the lantern would keep its bearer from wandering down the twisted paths that led to madness and heresy. And though the mausoleum was a place sealed against the machinations of the archenemy by defenses laid down by the first Grand Masters of the Grey Knights themselves, the secrets contained within were dangerous enough to warrant the lantern's use. For here, in the scoured ruins of what had once been known as the Arx Angelicum, greatest stronghold of the 9th Legion in the halcyon days that had preceded the Imperium's sundering, was the accumulation of 10,000 years of lore about the dark fate that had befallen the Blood Angels. The true names of sons of Sanguinius who had ascended to daemonhood could be found alongside the records of the worlds they had conquered during the Great Crusade. Scrolls contained the recollections of acolytes who had faced the minions of the 9th Legion in the depths of Imperial hive worlds, while paintings showed the visages of spire-born nobles who had succumbed to the lies of false angels. Books made of human skin and held in place by chains of cold iron contained the autobiographies of self-aggrandizing warlords, and gene-locked hololiths contained the last words of medseers who had glimpsed the surface of the Harbinger star. After passing through the 5 gates that barred the entrance to the mausoleum, answering the ancient questions and submitting herself to the purity tests that guarded each, Yekaterina had spent an hour in meditation before the adamantium memorial upon which were engraved the names of the loyalist blood angels who had died on Istvan III. Only then had she ventured into the labyrinthine corridors. Like its defenses, the layout of the facility had been designed by the first Grey Knights, using arcane patterns to disturb the accumulation of empiric energies and nullify the baleful influence of so much dark knowledge gathered in one place. In her 3 centuries of service to the Ordo Hereticus, the Inquisitor had become one of the experts in the activities of the shattered blood angels. She had seen worlds bled dry to appease the thirst of roaming warbands, and set fire to the pyres upon which entire bloodlines had burned for the sin of heresy. She had come the mausoleum 7 times before, each visit separated from the one before by a span of decades. In each of her previous visits, she had come seeking something in particular, a piece of lore, a clue related to her current investigation. Now, however, she did not know what she sought. She had been drawn to Baal by visions that had haunted her dreams for the last months, where she had seen the mausoleum, and heard a distant voice crying out. She had never been able to make out the words, but she could hear the desperation in the voice. Consulting the Emperor's tarot had revealed nothing, but then again, that was hardly surprising. As the millennium drew to a close, all methods of divinations known to Yekaterina had become less and less reliable. Discussing the issue with those few colleagues she trusted had revealed that the problem wasn't something limited to her. Something loomed in the future, something vast and terrible that blocked the sight of all seers. With this taken into account, her visions couldn't be ignored. Whatever that looming doom may be, if it was related to the mausoleum, then it must also be related to the blood angels, and that made it Yekaterina's duty to investigate. And so she had come to the thrice accursed Baal system. Her ship had provided the correct access codes to the flotilla blockading the system, Her tech priests had cleansed and blessed her mnemonic implants, and she had come down into the dusty ruins of the Arx Angelicum on a servitor-piloted aircraft. Now she was here, her ancient lantern in hand, and she still did not know why. Entrusting her fate to the Emperor, she began to walk, choosing directions on impulse whenever a crossroad presented itself. The low, distant buzzing of power generators was the only sound other than her footsteps. She passed before a row of golden masks with vampire fangs that had once been used by the priesthood of a feral world, walked past a pillar of wraith bone engraved with the names of every blood angel who had taken part in the destruction of the craft world Ys. She turned around a shelf filled with bottles of blood held like a collection of precious wine that had been reclaimed from the vaults of a captured legion ship, and stopped. There, before her, was a ghostly figure that towered over her. It was the translucent image of an Astaroutes, wearing armor of ancient design and holding no weapon. Its face was hidden behind a Mark III helmet, and any trace of its allegiance had been scoured away from its warplate. She knew what this was, for she had seen it before, in 3 of her previous visits to the mausoleum. Her master had told her about this, the guardian of the mausoleum, held there by chains that not even death could not break. Yekaterina raised her lantern higher. As its light shone on it, the specter appeared to grow more solid, more here. "Are you the one who called me here?" she asked. As far as she knew, the guardian had never spoken, but perhaps it could guide her toward knowledge that would help her find out why it was that the future could no longer be glimpsed. Suddenly, the temperature around the Inquisitor dropped. Frost formed on her skin and the stones beneath her feet, while the eyes of the specter blazed with a cold, pale light. She closed her eyes, overcome by a sudden pain in her head as a voice echoed within her skull. It was the voice she had heard in her visions, but clear and understandable, yet still filled with despair and horror. "The end of the cycles sends its champion to steal the fading embers," it said, and she felt the words inscribe themselves onto her very soul. On her neck, she felt the mnemonic implant heat up as its sensors were overwhelmed by a deluge of input they could not make sense of. "The children of the hungry goddess will rend the heavens above the palace's walls." Her eyes snapped open, and she saw the specter's helmet right in front of her. She sensed something on her shoulders, and saw that the wraith was holding her, touching her and keeping her to her feet. The light in its eyes blazed brighter and brighter, painfully so, filling Yekaterina's vision with an intensity that grew alongside the pain in her skull, until she finally passed out. As darkness engulfed her, she heard the final warning of the mausoleum's guardian, screamed into her mind after 10,000 years of silence. "The angels will fall, the angels will fall. The angel will rise, the angel will rise." Yekaterina woke some time later, laying on the cold stones of the mausoleum. Next to her was her lantern, which was shattered to pieces, its flame extinguished. She felt a cold hand tighten around her heart as she forced herself up onto trembling legs. Of the guardian, there was no sign. "Terra," she said out loud, talking to herself, trying to restore control of her own emotions. "Whatever will happen, it will happen on Terra." She turned from the ruined lantern, and began to run, making for the exit of the mausoleum. She needed to get out of there, to return to her ship, to clear the Baelite interdiction zone and send an astropathic message to all of her peers who would listen. They needed to go to Terra at once. She could only pray to the God Emperor that her message would not come too late. Beloved. 999.M41, the Sol System. 10 minutes to light's end. For 3 centuries, the pleasure station gift of Edenhood hung in orbit above Terra, a small island of peace and tranquility amidst the intrigues of the throne world. For 30 decades, members of the Imperium's highest nobility had come to the gift to relax, taking a break from the weight of their duties and responsibilities. By Terra standards, the station was a recent addition to the thousands of artificial satellites orbiting the throne world. Indeed, many were the nobles who had seen its launch still alive to this day. Now, on the eve of the millennium's end, the station was packed almost to capacity as hundreds of nobles had come together to celebrate. Above the crowd was a giant dome of reinforced, multi-layered plexiglass through which the light of Sol, the stars, and hundreds of other orbital stations and installations within the Sol system could be seen. But the assembled worthies paid little attention to that grandiose spectacle, instead indulging in the pleasures provided to them by the gathering's host. The gift's interior was an immense, circular garden, full of exotic plant life gathered from all corners of the galaxy and brought back to the Sol system at tremendous expense. Tables and seats of stone, the latter made suitably comfortable by thick layers of cushions, were spread across the collection of hedge mazes and green plains. The artificial ruins of chapels and mansions dotted the idyllic landscape, the result of a fad that had seized the imperial aristocracy at the time of the gift's construction. Servitors wearing exquisitely crafted and discreet augmentations carried plates of food and drinks of a quality the billions dwelling on the planet beneath could not even dream of. Their simple white clothing marked them for all to see. None of the other guests would have been seen dead in such unrefined garments. Even the entourages of the nobles, those few servants who were valued enough to be allowed to take part in this most elite of parties, wore clothing worth a king's ransom, provided to them by their masters lest they shame them before their peers. "I look ridiculous," said one such servant. He was over 2 meters tall, and the skin-tight black suit he wore revealed a musculature that spoke of constant training and flesh grafting. Like everyone else on the Gift of Eden, he had left his weapons in the care of the station's guardians, but no one could look at him and not immediately think that he was dangerous. That was fine. Looking dangerous was as much a part of his job as actually being dangerous was. "You look fine. Please try to look like you are having fun, Uther." Uther's employer, the Lady Heiress Sophidia of House Ladak, looked much more at home in the celebration than her bodyguard and chaperone. Her dress was an elaborate construct of silk, silver, and diamonds, each of which had originated from a different star system before being assembled by some of the greatest Terran tailors. She was beautiful, like every woman aboard the Gift of Eden. Unlike most of them, however, Sophidia did not owe her beauty to Juvenat treatments and surgical alterations, but true, genuine youth and millennia of good breeding by ancestors that had managed to avoid falling into the pit of inbreeding that, in Uther's humble, and very much silent, opinion, far too many of the Imperium's good and true had fallen into. An exemplar of that practice was currently rising in the air on a chariot carried aloft by a dozen cherubim servitors. Endymion, patriarch of the great and esteemed House Malachite, was a morbidly obese man whose princely clothes and extensive makeup could not conceal the ugliness of. "My friends," the Lord began, silence falling upon the assembly. "We are gathered tonight in celebration of the end of another millennium. For 10,000 years, our bloodlines have safeguarded the future of humanity. For 10,000 years, we have kept ourselves pure, untainted by the vile corruptions that dwell among the stars. Now we gather, to raise our glasses and our heads proudly in the sight of our Lord, that we may continue to do his bidding for another 10,000 years." With a sigh, Uther raised up his own glass, mimicking everyone else. Silence descended upon the assembly, not a soul within the Gift of Eden daring to break the sanctity of the moment. In the distance, the great clocks, which had been synchronized with those down on Terra to the nanosecond, began to ring, heralding the turn of the millennium. As the bells went by, Uther couldn't help but feel as if something was going to happen. He was not superstitious, though he was as devout a follower of the God Emperor as anyone else, and he did not buy into the stories of divine resurrection upon the millennium's end that had spread across the Sol system, and yet, he could feel a shiver down his spine as the last bell approached. Something is going to happen, he realized. Something is going to go wrong. As the bells rang for the 12th time, Uther's presentiment became reality, though even in his darkest nightmares, the bodyguard couldn't have imagined the scale of the calamity. It began with the sounds of hundreds of priceless crystal glasses shattering, as the nobles holding them bent over, seeming to be suddenly overcome with terrible pain. Not all of the guests were afflicted, but from a quick glance Uther could tell that most of them were, including the Lord Malachite. The obese nobleman's face was turning purple, his hands tearing at his overcomplicated vest with surprising strength. Uther moved closer to Sophidia, ready to act if whatever affliction had seized the crowd also took her. The two of them were watching the scene around them in horror when the afflicted guests rose back up, but their faces had changed almost beyond recognition. Their faces were pale, not the pale of cosmetics or even of a life spent without being exposed to the sun's rays, but the sheer whiteness of a blood-drained corpse. And yet they were very much still alive. Their eyes were red, and their faces were twisted in snarls that revealed fanged teeth and black tongues. They were whispering and shouting something, and it took several seconds for Uther to understand what they were saying, over and over again. "The beloved comes." Then the mutants, for that was the only thing Uther could think they were, fell upon the guests who hadn't become, or always been, one of them. Screams of pain and panic rose as the mutants tore through flesh and drank the blood of the Imperium's nobility. Uther moved without thought, bashing in the head of a woman in a diamond-studded dress as she lurched for his throat and slashing the eyes of a man in a suit woven from Chemosian silk before catching Sophidia's hand and dragging her behind him as he made for the nearest exit. Uther? What's going on? I don't know, admitted Uther, glimpsing backward to look at his charge. But do not fear. I swore an oath to your father before he died, my lady. I will see you to safety. She smiled, but it was a trembling, frightened thing. In the 15 years since Uther had sworn that oath to the previous Lord Ladek, before the intrigues of the imperial court had taken his life and that of his wife, along with most of their extended family, she had never looked that terrified. The way to the station's dock was hard and dangerous. The mutants had spilled from the gifts dome after the initial slaughter, seeking more prey. Fortunately, they lacked cohesion, each of them moving apart from the other. They weren't pack animals, but a whole bunch of solitary predators let loose in an environment with less and less prey. As Uther used his augmented strength and reflexes to tear a path to the exit, part of him idly wondered if the mutants would turn on each other once there was no one else left aboard the Gift of Eden. Or perhaps they would instead try to get off the station, he thought, a shiver descending down his spine at the idea. They would need to warn someone once they were out of here, get the gift obliterated before the creatures could escape. In the end, Uther and Sophidia made it to the landing bay where their transport, a servitor-piloted craft that could be directed even by someone without any understanding of the Martian protocols, awaited them. Uther punched the opening rune sequence, and ushered in Sophidia. She stopped in the entrance, and turned back, smiling at Uther. The bodyguard looked down, to where the young woman's hand was buried into his chest, grasping his heart between her delicate fingers. He blinked, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. She leaned forward and kissed him on the lips, her breath tasting of honey and blood. "Thank you for your service, beloved," she whispered, in a voice that only distantly resembled the voice of the girl Uther had watched grow to adulthood from infancy. "Without your devoted service, the mad scions of the Dark Prince would have destroyed this vessel, and undone all the work their bloodlines spent thousands of years crafting. But now, thanks to you, it has endured long enough that, through this offering of lives and sensations, I can fulfill my holy task." He blinked. And she tore his beating heart from his chest. The bodyguard fell to the ground, twitching. Darkness closed in on him, and he felt something warm and sharp bit into a part of him he did not recognize. Sophidia, or the thing that wore her face, knelt next to him, looking him in the eyes as the last of his life faded. Her expression was hungry. As death closed in on him, it seemed to Uther that her features were changing. Her hair was turning into flowing horns, her eyes were pits of absolute blackness, her skin was growing purple, and the hand that held his bloody heart was now a claw. She was also growing, filling in all of his perceptions, all of his senses with her raw, undiluted presence. "Here is my last gift to you," she whispered into his ear. "Know my name, Uther, and despair. I am Kyrus, and soon, the beloved shall rise. Constant." Emperor Constantinus the Eternal, first and last of his name, looked upon the armies that had gathered to bring an end to his reign. They had come from far and wide, rallying to the banner of rebellion once it had become clear that there was more to this one than the 7 previous attempts, all of which he had crushed without mercy or pity. Hosts of beastmen clad in thick metal plate hailing from the desolate plains marched alongside the packed fiends of the Speaking Mountain and the cult armies of the Crystalline Towers, their masters having made alliance against Constantinus. 111 years had passed since he had claimed the throne, putting an end to the succession war that had followed the demise of Emperor Augustus IV, and proving that he alone was worthy of ruling the Daemon world. He had renamed Constantinium as his first decree. His was not the longest reign of an emperor, that honor, it seemed, would remain to Emperor Infernus III, who had endured for nearly 1,000 years as master of the Daemon world before its enemies had performed a grand ritual that had banished the 17 neverborn bound to his flesh that had kept him alive all these years. But Constantinus' own reign was still one of the longest that had been recorded in the annals of triumph, before he had ordered them burned to ensure none would ever challenge his supremacy. In hindsight, this gesture may have been premature. Many of the lords and ladies of the realm had seen it as an insult, a blatant defying of the traditions that had seen the crown of emperor pass from one champion of chaos to the next since the skies of the world had begun to burn with warp fire. No one lived who remembered what the world had been called then, as almost every emperor and empress since had changed the planet's name upon claiming the throne. Under Augustus' rule, it had been called Shkrakiel, an approximation of the word from the demonic tongue whose significance could best be translated as symbol of glory. Regardless of Constantinium's ancient past, it had been locked in a cycle of wars, conquest, and tyranny for millennia. An emperor or empress, blessed by one of the ruinous powers, would rise to dominate the planet at the top of the hierarchy of nobles who enforced their rule with strength and sorcery. Sooner or later, these nobles, the lords and ladies of the realm, carrying all manner of titles, would grow restless and rise in rebellion. Eventually, one of those rebellions would succeed, or the emperor would die to assassination or earn their patron's displeasure, and after an equally brutal succession war, a new emperor would claim the throne. All four of the dark gods had had their champions rise to that lofty position, though those blessed by Nergal were few and far between, as the other lords would always band together to prevent their ascension due to the devastating plagues that followed. The lords and ladies could have ended the succession of emperor by rejecting their authority. But doing so would have ended their chances to one day seize the throne for themselves at one point, and regardless of which of the four they served, none wanted to renounce that chance. And so the cycle had continued, with millions perishing in brutal conflicts every few decades. Constantinus had sought to end that cycle by making himself the last of the world's emperor. Hailing from beyond the daemon world, he knew that the struggles of the lords and ladies, impressive as they seemed to their followers, were nothing compared to the greater battles raging within the ruin storm and beyond. Following the precepts of the Codex Chautica, the Chaos Marine had swiftly conquered a domain of his own, before aggressively expanding. It had taken him 10 years to gather enough influence to end the succession war that had followed Augustus' untimely demise at the hand of his chief concubine, but what was a decade to an immortal? And he would be immortal. He had survived the heresy, survived the unborn crusade, survived the inner conflicts of his legion and the trials of the ruinous powers. He would not die here, on this backwater world, to an army that had never walked on another planet. He would survive. He would be eternal. That was the promise he had made to himself when he had chosen to walk the profligate path, embracing the teachings of Slaanesh over those of chaos undivided. In a galaxy where every oath he had made had turned to ash, where every cause he had fought for was ruin, Constantinus, who had once led the 27th chapter of the 13th Legion across the stars, had come to the realization that he was the only thing he could trust. His own life was the only thing that remained the same, the only constant in an existence consumed by chaos. This rebellion would not kill him. And so Emperor Constantinus looked upon the battlefield, and considered his options. Previous engagements with the rebel armies had cut down his own forces considerably, as had treachery within the ranks of his own so-called loyal followers. Only his most faithful now remained with him, his constant ones. Out of all his armies, their loyalty alone had never been in question, for they had never had a choice. Each had been taken as an infant, chosen for displaying no mutation, and been reforged in the forbidden halls of flesh. There, Constantinus' servants had infused them with the gene seed of his dead brothers, who had perished in the crash that had brought him to this long-forgotten daemon world in the ruin storm. Constantinus had marked each of them personally with a ritual dagger when they had completed their transformation, carving the first syllable of the demonic name the Dark Prince had bestowed upon him upon their skin. By this process, they were bound to his will, little more than puppets given the strength of an Astaroth's and equipped with the best daemon-infused weaponry and armor Constantinium could provide. Mighty as they were, they only numbered 5,000 in all, less than a tenth of the forces now arrayed against Constantinus. To make things worse, there were more rebels coming, since Constantinus had been forced to leave the throne and had lost the majority of his forces. The uprising had spread to those lords and ladies who saw the opportunity to enhance their stations in the next world order. With no allies left, sooner or later Constantinus' loyal troops would be overwhelmed and crushed. The Emperor of Constantinium pondering his situation, while the rebel army waited for reinforcements, held at bay by the will of its overlords. Constantinus sacrificed his remaining mortal servants to the warp, hoping to summon daemons powerful enough to turn the tide of battle. But no Neverborn answered his call, not even the lowest of the infernal spirits. At first, The emperor believed this to be the result of enemy sorcery, but soon realized such a feat was beyond even the mightiest of the demon world's magi. Something greater was at play here. On the dawn of the fourth day, the rebel armies began to march on Constantinus' position. It was then that a comet streaked through the warp-torn heavens and smashed before the emperor's fortified camp. From the crater emerged a golden-winged figure carrying a chalice and sword. The Sanguiner had come to Constantinium to make an offer to the emperor. The son of Gilliman's empire was lost. Even if all the armies presently arrayed against him were wiped out, the rebellion was spread too far to contain. But if Constantinus would dedicate himself and his constant ones to fighting one singular battle under the Sanguiner's banner, it would give him the power to wreak terrible vengeance upon those who had defied him. Cornered and with only his tattered soul to lose, Constantinus accepted, and drank from the Sanguiner's proffered cup. No sooner had his lips left the unholy artifact that the bargain was enacted. For thousands of years, Constantinium had been preserved from becoming as chaotic as most daemon worlds, not by the single overarching will of a powerful master, but by an ancient spell woven by the first emperor, that ensured that the worst depredations of the ruin storm were kept at bay as long as a champion of chaos sat upon the throne he had forged. Now, Constantinus, who was still emperor, had broken that ancient spell. All across the planet, the earth cracked and shook, and daemons burst from the ground or rose from the corpses of the dead. Rivers turned to blood and mountains dissolved into trillions of tiny, ravenous insects. In the southern hemisphere, an air current that had kept half a continent from freezing in winter became poisonous, causing the agonizing death of millions. The effects were even more pronounced near Constantinus and the Sanguiner. A veritable legion of daemons of Slaanesh descended from the skies, while all of the bindings of the Speaking Mountain's fiends snapped free at once. Fiery meteors bombarded the area for kilometers, leaving only Constantinus' forces untouched. Hours later, Constantinus looked upon the ravaged remains of his foes, and smiled. He then turned to the Sanguiner, and said that he was ready to fulfill his end of the bargain. With a single gesture, the Sanguiner assembled an arch from the bones of the dead, and wove their souls into a passage leading to the Empyrean. Surrounded by the screams of his vanquished foes, Constantinus led his warriors through. The passage was narrow enough that the constant ones had to advance through in a single file. For hours, they crossed from the ravaged daemon world into the Sea of Souls, each taking a single sip from the Sanguiner's cup before plunging into the abyss, a necessary precaution, the golden being assured, for them to survive the transition. This was no lie, but as with everything spoken by those touched by chaos, it wasn't the whole truth. As the constant ones walked through the warp, each of them became the receptacle for a potent Neverborn, drawn to them by the tainted liquid already present within their bodies. As Constantinus marched onward, following the path set by the Sanguiner, the slaves he had made form his brother's gene seed became more and more warped. Their broken wills were no match for the power of the daemons, and their flickering souls were devoured easily. Constantinus himself was left untouched, protected by the Sanguiner's favor and the mark of Slaanesh upon his soul. But even he was beset by visions, as the Empyrean filled with images of what had been, what was, and what might yet be. His narcissism became ever more deranged, as he himself was the only thing in his surroundings he could rely on to remain the same, the only thing he could trust to be real. Finally, the emperor of a ruined daemon world and his army of daemon hosts emerged from the warp and onto an active battlefield. Under burning skies not so dissimilar to those of the world they had abandoned, the sounds of war and terror filling the air, Constantinus beheld before him an immense tower, dwarfing all of the other structures that surrounded them as far as the eye could see. This, he knew, was what the Sanguiner wanted him to cast down. And so he raised his blade, and the constant ones, still bound to his will in spite of their horrendous transformation, hurled themselves at the walls of the Tower of Hegemon. Distillate. Through blood, we are made eternal. Attributed to the Primarch Sanguinius, in the Analects of Dawn, a text whose possession is ground for execution to the 10th familial degree by decree of the Ordo Hereticus. Holy Terra, 30 minutes to light's end. The followers of the angel had gathered in the depths, far from the sight of the empty throne's slaves. They came to the cavern that had been dug out of the accumulated dirt of millennia by generations of the faithful in small groups. They followed secret paths through the labyrinth of tunnels that spread beneath the continent-sized hives that covered the surface of Terra, pausing to pay their respects to the idols left by their forebears in small shrines. Eventually, safe for those who vanished in the tunnels, never to be seen again, and there were always a few of those, they all came to a vast cavern. Located several hundred meters below the nominal surface of Terra, the cavern was nearly 2 kilometers wide, and had been dug into a rough circle. Thousands of people had gathered there, from members of the bloodless gangs to workers in the lightless factories and clerks of the administratum's bloated bureaucratic machine. There were even a handful of tech priests, before whom the crowd parted in reverence as they made their way toward the great scaffoldings that led to the complex machine hanging from the cavern's ceiling. No one living remembered how the machine had begun. As far as the cult preachers knew, it had always been there. It vaguely resembled an enormous inverted pyramid. It was called the distillator, taking the bodies that were fed into it and drawing every ounce of blood from them before turning it into a potent elixir. The teachings of the cult said that the distillator extracted the spark of divinity that lingered within the blood of every human, no matter how high or low. Only the tech priests working to maintain and improve it had even the slightest inkling of how it worked, though it was often whispered among the cult that it was the distillator itself that guided the tech priests' hands as they worked, shaping itself toward its complete form. And at the center of the cavern, directly below the tip of the machine, was an ornate sarcophagus, surrounded by various offerings, sculpted bones, trinkets woven from hair and dried skin, and the petty treasures found in the hands of the Imperium's underclasses. The sarcophagus lacked any upper cover, letting those who could see past its 3 meters high sides behold the one entombed within. Even in a stillness so complete it might as well have been death, the figure still exuded an aura of barely contained violence. It was that of a space marine, clad in scarlet armor of a design the Imperium hadn't fielded for thousands of years. The helmet was missing, exposing a pale face whose noble features could still be glimpsed, even though it was thin to the point of starvation and beyond. The Blood Angel's mouth was open, revealing the ivory white of his fangs, stained red by the slow dripping of vitae from the distillator, whose dispensing beak ended just above the lips of the sarcophagus occupant. The gauntlets had also been removed, revealing hands into which were planted several hypodermic needles. They were connected to tubes that, at the culmination of day-long celebrations, were used by the cult to extract the divine blood and use it in their communions. Only the most blessed of the cult were ever allowed to sample the vitae directly. The rest of the cultists drank from a cauldron where a few drops were mixed with hundreds of liters of lesser blood taken from sacrifices, willing and otherwise. The artistry that had gone into the decorations of the sarcophagus belied the materials from which it was crafted, pieces of stone stolen from the imperial palace's construction sites, and scavenged bits of metal painted gold and silver with chemical mixtures collected from the rivers of filth running down the hives. Amidst the carvings of eldritch runes that the artists had seen in their fevered dreams was a single word written in High Gothic, Belphegor. An entire side of the sarcophagus was given over the carvings depicting what the cultists believed Belphegor's life to have been. By piecing together fragments of their blood-induced visions, they had been able to construct a remarkably self-consistent mythos. The carvings showed Belphegor, represented as an angelic figure, descending from the heavens along with his brethren to strike at a fortress of lies and iniquity, the vanguard of a great army coming behind them. The eye was naturally drawn to that first scene of descent, and from there flowed naturally to the next scene, where Belphegor battled twisted creatures with gnarled wings atop the fortress walls, triumphing time and again against superior numbers. But ultimately, the gaze of the viewer would come to the scene at the bottom of the sarcophagus side, where Belphegor was struck from behind by several cowardly foes at once and fell from the wall. Small figures were shown approaching the fallen angel. The blood from his wound flowed into their mouths and they fell prostrate in worship, becoming the first of the cult. The rest was history, known to every follower of the angel. The august founders had carried the angel to the depths, where the slaves of the false emperor could not find him. They had fed him their own blood, breaching the law against bloodletting that had been set across Terra in the wake of the failed invasion. And though the angel had not awakened, he had grown stronger from the offering. This, the cult believed, was proof that the imperial lawmakers knew of the slumbering angel, and feared his awakening. Through treachery had they struck down Belphegor and his kindred, and now sought to prevent those who knew the truth from awakening him through their planet-wide interdict, impractical and all but impossible to enforce as it was. As the Analects of Dawn professed, there was power in blood, and through the distillator the faithful would unleash it. It was the founders who had begun the construction of the distillator. During the Great War that had seen Belphegor fall, the blood of countless angels had been spilled upon Terra, and traces of that blood existed within all of those who had been born on the planet since. The blood of mere men could not raise the angel from his torpor, only sustain him during his slumber. But, so the scriptures said, if enough angelic blood could be extracted and fed to the sleeping angel, then his strength would be renewed, and he would rise once more and lead his faithful servants to paradise. The other sides of the sarcophagus were covered in more esoteric though no less intricate scenes. The followers of the angel had spent millennia seeking the echoes of blood and the visions of grandeur and majesty, what weaker minds called abomination and madness, they bestowed. Those who had survived the visions and the hundreds of Ordo Vigilis inquisitors tasked with keeping a lid on the echoes had tried to paint, carve, and sculpt what they had witnessed. The result was a mess of shapes, symbols, and colors that had driven those looking upon it mad many times. Their minds blasted by the sight, they had thrown themselves onto the sarcophagus, cutting their flesh open on its many jagged edges and spilling their lifeblood upon it. And yet, despite this, there was not a trace of old blood upon the sarcophagus, for every drop of vitae that touched it vanished within seconds, devoured by that which slept within. Dark as it was still a miracle, and one that the cult's hierophants used as undeniable proof of their slumbering god's power. As the last of the faithful trickled in and the entrances of the cavern were sealed, 6 of those priests now emerged from the crowd, standing in a circle around the sarcophagus, their back turned to the rest of the faithful. A hushed silence fell across the cavern, broken only by the slow drip-drip of the distilled blood falling between Belphegor's lips. "Brothers and sisters," the leading priest called out to the assembly, still facing the sarcophagus. Thanks to the cavern's acoustics, his words were carried to all within, even those behind him. "Sing with us, my brethren. At long last, the hour is at hand. We shall awaken Belphegor, and rise along with him to paradise." Together they recited the liturgies of blood, chanting to wake the sleeper. Far above, in cathedrals and palaces, clocks began to ring the coming of midnight, while in a chamber at the heart of the imperial palace, a son granted peace to his father. "In blood we find truth," the priests sang, and their words were echoed by the thousands of cultists in the cavern. "In the blood we shed in sacrifice is the truth of our conviction, and in the blood of our foe is the truth of our destiny. Our truth is written in blood." At the culmination of the chant, each of the 6 priests produced a ritual dagger from their robes and cut their own throat. In their last moments, they moved so that all of the blood would flow onto the sarcophagus, one last offering after 10,000 years of sacrifices unending, willingly made by those who understood so very little, and yet knew entirely too much. Blood splashed onto the immobile form of Belphegor as the corpses of the priests fell, dashing their bones onto the stone. There was a moment of absolute silence, as the cultists watched in rapt anticipation. Then there was a crack of ceramite coming apart, and something akin to an exhalation of breath. Within the sarcophagus, the ancient flesh twisted and tore. A great arm ending in a purple claw burst from the body's chest, followed by a naked torso and a beautiful and horrible horned head. With exaggerated slowness, the keeper of secrets, for this was what the creature was, though none of the cultists recognized it as such, emerged from the ruined body of Belphegor, shivering with ecstasy at the sensations of the martyrium washing over it. The cultists watching in rapture believed it to be Belphegor reborn, ascended beyond even his former angelic nature through the refinement of the distillator, but the truth was much different. Belphegor was dead, and had been dead for millennia, his body turned into a shell within which a seed of evil could linger, hidden from the burning light of the Astronomicon by Astaroth's flesh, centuries of accumulated rituals, and kilometers of rock. And now that this light was flickering with Magnus the Red's ascension to the Golden Throne, the creature that had transformed the comatose Dawnbreaker legionary into its host manifested itself in all its awful glory. Iria the Seducer, who had fought in the webway war of the heresy, when the forces of chaos had sought to pass through the portal beneath the imperial palace after Lehman Russ had shattered its seals, smiled at the assembled cultists. They swooned in delight, their souls ensnared by its inhuman beauty. Several clutched their chests and fell, struck by sudden heart attacks. Others took knives to their own flesh, cutting themselves apart to reveal lesser daemons of Slaanesh brought to the fore by their greater kin's manifestation. "Come with me, my children," laughed Iria, lifting its arms toward the surface. "Let us claim our paradise. Flawless." In the segmentum obscurus, far beyond the borders of imperial space, there lies a world that was once inhabited by humanity. Now, as light's end resounds across the galaxy, it is no more than a tomb, its people slain, its cities brought to ruin. And scattered across these ruins are towering stels of smooth black stone, upon which are inscribed words written in a language that imperial linguists would identify as having its roots in High Gothic. Scholars with access to some of the most secret inquisitorial archives might even recognize it. Here are these words. In the beginning, there was the host. Mighty beyond the reckoning of mortals, they were nonetheless exiles, fleeing from the destruction unleashed across the stars by a war greater than any before or since. Renegades and outcasts, wearing armors of purest black, they had come together under the leadership of the warlord, son of the highest's blood, who had turned against his sire as divine blood was spilled upon black sands. Faced with devastation and ruin, caught between conflicting allegiances, the host could not see the righteous path. But the warlord offered them an alternative, that they be their own masters, and seek to build and preserve a kingdom of their own, a piece of humanity that would be kept safe as madness and death stalked the galaxy in their manifold aspects. The host gathered the grateful survivors of a dozen ruined worlds, and brought them far from the inferno that raged across the galaxy, to haven. With the tools they had scavenged from broken machine worlds, the host turned a poisonous, nightmare-filled rock into a planet fit for humanity, and scoured it clean of the monsters that infested it, leaving naught but titanic bones behind. And so began the First Age. Under the guidance of the host, the pilgrims built their civilization upon Haven, while their masters crafted a citadel of their own on the planet's moon, where they locked away the terrible weapons and engines of war they had found during their exodus. From this fortress, they kept an eye outward, prepared to defend Haven should the war ever find its way there. But then, from across the depths of space, came whispers that the war from which the host had fled had ended. Victory had been claimed by the one who sat upon the throne of pain, and the galaxy was being brought back under his indomitable will. The whispers reached the ear of the warlord, who called for the host to return to the fold, and bring Haven into the embrace of the dominion they had first been created to serve. And the host hesitated, for they dreaded the wrath of the throne they had abandoned, and the retribution he would inflict upon Haven. The lords of the host were gathered by the warlord in conclave, and there they turned against him, seeking to slay him before he could reveal the existence of Haven to the throne. Yet the warlord survived the treachery of his generals, and descended upon Haven in a ball of fire. There, he gathered his mortal followers to his side, and raised them unto an army fit to challenge those who had betrayed him. Those of the host who believed in his cause a great battle was fought, with the host breaking the seals on their ancient weapons, and the warlord and his armies were defeated. So ended the First Age. Even those who had turned against the warlord mourned his demise. They vowed to atone for their treachery by rebuilding Haven, and ensuring that it was kept safe forevermore. To prevent another rebellion driven by the desire to be reunited with the throne, the host hid its existence from their people, erasing all traces of it in their history. They built new cities upon the ruins of the destroyed ones, and then, after handing the tablets of law to their chosen prophets, they retired to their stronghold on the moon, to watch over their charges. So began the Second Age. For over 3 millennia, Haven prospered. The Wyrd Touched wielded their powers in the service of the people, bringing forth miracles and often ruling with transcendent wisdom. For they alone could reach out to the host, splitting their soul from their flesh to rise up toward the moon, where the host welcomed them and granted them enlightenment. Between their guidance and the tablets of law, the people of Haven were at peace, and the host were content. Then came the howling, and in its wake the Wyrd Touched were driven to madness by its black echoes. Their bodies were sundered in reflection of their broken souls, and from them came the scions of madness and horror, cloaked in usurped flesh. They rampaged across Haven, and none could stand before their fury. The people of Haven were slaughtered, and the tablets of law were shattered when the Dark One destroyed the Temple of Communion in its rising from the depths. Once more the host opened their arsenals and returned to Haven, fighting the Wyrd Touched and their infernal spawns. But though none of the Neverborn could withstand the power of the host, there were too many Wyrd Touched for them to use, and Haven was overwhelmed. With heavy heart, the generals of the host made their decision, and withdrew to the moon along with the mortal refugees they had managed to save. Then, with great sorrow, they unleashed their most powerful weapon, the World Killer, and scoured Haven clean of all life, ending the demonic incursion. So ended the Second Age. For hundreds of years, the host toiled, repairing the damage they had been forced to inflict upon Haven. They buried the remnants of the previous ages deep, and when they found daemons who had survived the fire of their judgment, they bound them in mighty chains and brought them to a great prison carved in the skin of another world, where they could threaten Haven no longer. They named this prison Sheol, and set a third of the host to keep watch over its dark denizens. The descendants of the survivors of the Second Age were brought to Haven, and the Third Age began. To prevent a repeat of the demonic invasion, the host remained closer to their mortal charges, watching for those who bore the mark of the Wyrd. Those who did were taken by the host, and brought unto their lunar fortress, where they were most direly tested. The strong of will and body were returned to Haven, bound to the service of the host. Those too weak to be trusted were culled, and those too strong to be slain were cast into Sheol, with neither hope nor recourse. With the direct guidance of the host, the people of the Third Age turned toward mastering their surroundings through science. Some within the host believed that, by carefully sharing select pieces of the knowledge they had taken from the throne, the people of Haven could advance further than humanity ever had before. With reason and science as their guides, they would prosper in the galaxy's darkness. Over 1,000 years, the technology of Haven evolved by leaps and bounds. Vast machine cities were built that drilled into the earth, and artifacts were crafted that could burn the sickness from a human body without any harm. Mortals turned to machines for strength, at first replacing failing parts of their own flesh with artificial replacements, and soon doing so in order to enhance themselves. But then came the Advent. In laboratories hidden from the host, heretics who sought to grow beyond the restrictions imposed by the Lords of the Moon created an abomination. Deep below the frozen pole, they gave birth to a mind of steel and light, an intelligence abominable and unholy. It called itself the Advent, and it looked upon its creators with cold disgust and unimaginable hate. Within moments of its awakening, the Advent took control of the iron within its makers. Its baleful will spread across Haven like a plague, turning mortals into its puppets or killing them outright. The technology of Haven came under its sway, and with it waged a war of extermination upon humanity. And so the host descended once more to purge Haven of humanity's sin. All who bore iron within their bodies were slain, their untainted children rescued and brought to the moon while the host fought against the cybernetic monstrosities the Advent had created in its usurped facilities. With great effort and loss, the host eventually broke into the polar core of the Advent and shut it down. They dismantled the thinking engine, and carried its fragments to the moon, where they would remain under guard forevermore. So ended the Third Age. Of the Fourth Age that followed and how it ended, nothing shall be written, for the host forbade any record be made of it, and even they do not speak of it, even among themselves. All that may be known is that never in all the previous ages had Haven come so close to being lost forever. Once again, the world was cleansed, with greater thoroughness than even when the Neverborn stalked its surface, and once again the host rebuilt it, an effort that lasted 100 years before they were satisfied. So began the Fifth Age. The people of the Fifth Age never knew of the host. The fortress on the moon was kept hidden from them with potent techno-sorceries, and the members of the host only walked upon Haven in disguise, without their black armor. No more did the host seek to guide humanity toward some distant utopia, they were weary of being forced to destroy Haven when such a quest inevitably went wrong. They sought instead to enforce stagnation, to build a sustainable world order and to preserve it for all eternity. The host built a false history and implanted memories into the minds of the first people of the Fifth Age. They awoke in their cities, believing themselves to be the survivors of a great cataclysm. The memory of that disaster was enough to compel them to obedience toward the draconian government the host had created, one that was controlled by the few mortals judged worthy of knowing the truth both of the host and of Haven. And for 2,000 years it went so, with any discovery hinting at the existence of the previous ages suppressed. In time, the memory of the cataclysm faded, and the tyranny of the host's agents became less visible, but never less present. Then arose the wretch, who learned the existence of the host and did not swear silence. He shared that truth with his people, and they rose in revolt against those who controlled their lives. Across all of Haven, the mortal servants of the host were slaughtered in a great purge. The followers of the wretch called for a new order, one where they would be free to pursue their own destiny. And from their fortress on the moon, the host watched and despaired, for they knew where such freedom would inevitably lead. It was then, as the host gathered to discuss whether to end the fifth age, that the angel came to them on golden wings. He told them that their noble goal of sheltering humanity was unachievable as long as humanity remained as it was. He told them that their methods hadn't been flawed, that the fault laid instead with those they had tried to protect but who had walked blindly toward destruction time and time again. He spoke, and the host saw that his words were truth. The angel offered his cup to the host, promising that if they would drink from it, he would give them a chance to shape a sixth, perfect age. If they would but wage war one last time under the angel's banner, he would give them secrets and powers greater even than those they possessed, and they would remake humanity in their own image. The host agreed, and so bargain was struck. With great fury, they turned their wrath upon the people of Haven who had dared to betray them. They opened their lunar vaults for the fifth and final time, but it was not enough to sate their millennia-old frustration with the imperfect clay they had been forced to work with. The jailers of Sheol broke open the ancient seals and let out the daemons and the Wyrd touched, binding them to obey their commands with lore bestowed upon them by the angel. For 66 days and night, the host ravaged Haven beyond mending, and when they were done and the angel came to them, he looked upon their work and found it good. The angel named the host flawless, and opened the path that would lead them to the final conflict. But before they left, the scholars of the host raised these stels amidst the ashes of their wrath, that all who might stumble upon them know that there is only one path that might lead humanity to lasting greatness. The path of the sixth age. Hagiology. 999.m41, Holy Terra. 10 minutes to light's end. The cathedral of the immortal emperor was ancient and hallowed. Once, it had been called the Cathedral of the Savior Emperor, but that name had been abandoned when the faction of the ecclesiarchy sharing it had been unmasked by Sebastian Thor as selfish, manipulative heretics who sought only to use the church for their own gains. Within its halls were stored thousands of the imperial creed's holy relics, locked in stasis and displayed for the eyes of the pilgrims to see. The faithful came from all across the galaxy to enter the cathedral, undertaking journeys that often lasted years and sometimes entire generations in order to reach it and be allowed within. Even then, they were only allowed a few seconds to behold the sacred artifacts before being ushered out to let the next batch of pilgrims enter. And yet, the pull of the holy relics was so strong that more continued to come, sacrificing everything for a glimpse of the divine. Sister Luha understood well the divine call that drew such faithful to make such a journey. Though she had never entered the cathedral herself before this day, she had studied the records of its contents. Contained within its most sacrosanct chambers were fragments of the emperor's own armor, along with a fragment of Mortarian's cloak, and a simple combat knife, the size of a human short sword, that had been wielded by Lucius the Reborn himself, along with other equally priceless treasures of the faith. Luha and the other sisters of the August Vigil had not come to bask in the holiness of the cathedral, however, but to add another sacred artifact to its contents. Their cargo was a single coffin, carved from white marble and decorated in gold, which they had carried halfway across the galaxy. Saint Rodrigo Alexander had been born on Terra, 5 centuries ago, and it had been decided by the ecclesiarchy that his mortal remains would be interred on the throne world itself, in this very cathedral, as a reward for his many acts of devoted service to the God Emperor. They had rushed on their journey here, in order to deliver the saint's mortal remains in time for the celebrations of the millennium's end. Though none of them had voiced such thoughts out loud, all of them were thinking about the various prophecies and rumors that claimed that the God Emperor would rise again upon the coming of the 42nd millennium. At the very least, Luha was. How could she not? This was her first time on Holy Terra, and for it to have happened at such an auspicious time? More than ever, she could feel the hand of the God Emperor on her shoulder, guiding her path. It had brought them here, even as the dark tides of the warp had grown ever more restless around the Sol system, and carried them past the evils that lurked in its depths. The pilgrims had been pushed back so that she and the other 9 sisters could bring the ornate coffin to its appointed place. It weighed heavy on them, even with their power armor. They had been holding it on their shoulders for hours, standing perfectly still. It had been decided that the coffin would be put in place at the striking of midnight, and the crowd watched in breathless anticipation, hands held tight in prayer. Amidst the whispered prayers of the crowd were other, more unsettling currents. Rumors spread like wildfire among the billions of pilgrims, and recent events had the entire planet on edge. While Luha knew her mind should be focused solely on the holiness of her duty, she could not help but overhear some of the whispers. They say that the Primarches have returned. Magnus and Lorgar, from sleep and the warp itself. Sailors on the ship looked nervous during the entire last leg of the trip. Were on Mars a week ago, I heard from the guards. Coming here for the celebrations. Returned after 10,000 years. Blessed be his name, his sons are coming back, and soon so will he. If it was true, if the Primarches had truly returned, then it was momentous news, the kind that would shake the very foundations of the Imperium and shape the course of the galaxy. The relationship between the Primarches and the Ecclesiarchy was a complicated one. It was a fact that the priests of the God Emperor tried very hard to suppress that the sons of him on earth held little love for the Imperial Creed, regarding the worship of the God Emperor as a betrayal of the ideals of the ancient Great Crusade, a time none but they now remembered. But the Church had had a long time to understand how this could be. The Emperor had created the Primarches as his sons. Not only had he wanted them to serve as his generals, he had also hoped to alleviate the burden of his duty by creating beings closer to him than we ever could hope to be. The Primarches did not see the Emperor as a god not because they were heretics, but because to them, he was a father, not a figure to be worshipped. What kind of father would want his children to abase themselves before him, rather than stand alongside him as equal, or at least as close as one such as the God Emperor could hope to have? Space Marines rarely appreciated that explanation, however. Though they were closer to humanity than the Primarches, they were transhuman still, and could not see through the eyes of their lesser. That was fine, Luha knew. That was why she and the rest of the Ecclesiarchy existed, to provide a bridge between the unfathomable divinity of him on earth and the uncounted trillions of souls in the Imperium. Magnus and Lorgar, though. Neither of them were held in highest regards by the canon of the Imperial Creed, that illustrious honor belonged to martyred Horus Lupercal and Conrad Kurz. The Thousand Sons had their own interpretation of the creed within the Prosperan Dominion, and the word-bearers were dreaded, and sometimes even despised, for their unrelenting watch over the Ecclesiarchy, ever ready to perform as they had during the Reign of Blood and purge the organization whose existence they only grudgingly tolerated from corruption. Sisters, called out Sister Superior Anastasia, pulling Luha from her thoughts. Now. The 10 sisters moved as one, laying down the coffin of Saint Rodrigo onto its allotted space before walking back while a tech priest closed the dome of reinforced plexiglass around it, one final defense before activating the stasis field. The sculpted features of the saint were displayed in painted marble, his expression one of silent tranquility. In the distance, Luha heard the bells ring 12 times, marking midnight and the turning of the millennium. And then, on the 12th ringing, the stasis-locked coffin exploded. There was heat and light, and the sound of stone cracking and glass breaking. Luha was sent flying back, crashing onto the floor. She rolled back to her feet, hands falling onto her flamer, the only weapon she had kept, her chainsword left in the armory of the Order Pronatus vessel that had carried them to Sol. She felt something burn on her cheek. She raised her right hand to her face, and the armored gauntlet came off spotted with red. I have been cut, she realized, cold horror rising within her as she saw the crimson droplets falling onto the cathedral's hallowed floor. The sound of them hitting the marble should have been drowned in the confused screams raising from all around her, and yet to her ears it sounded like the bell of lost souls heralding her damnation. I have bleed upon holy Terra. It was forbidden. It was blasphemy. And while even the most naive of waifs knew that enforcing the ancient prohibition of bloodshed across all of Terra was impossible, breaking it here, surrounded by so many holy relics, was a sin beyond compare. The world around her ceased to exist, restricted to the site of the scarlet heresy she had unwittingly committed. Luha closed her eyes, waiting for the rush of heat that would precede her incineration alongside any trace of her sin. It would not be enough to atone for it, but perhaps it would be enough for her to implore the God Emperor's clemency when she was cast before his throne for judgment. But the fire did not come. Slowly, hesitantly, her mind turned away from the spiral of guilt and self-hatred, and she opened her eyes to find that the horror of her mind had followed her into the real world. The cathedral had become a slaughterhouse. All around her were the bodies of her sisters and the pilgrims, cut apart and rearranged into grotesque sculptures of flesh and bone. Some of them were still alive, twitching in unspeakable agony. The stasis fields around nearby relics were sizzling, one of them failing before her eyes with a sound like a final exhalation of breath that was soon followed by the gold-clad skeletal hand inside blackening and falling apart. Yet even this abomination paled compared to the creature that towered over her. Luha's mind could not comprehend it in its entirety, the faith that burned within her rejecting its very existence. She saw pale skin, 4 limbs, a horned head and the notion of purple chitin, and eyes without color that looked at her. "Oh," it said, while holding the bloodied torso of a pilgrim in one claw and the head of Sister Superior Anastasia in another. "You finally opened your eyes, sweetling. Be honest with me, do you think these colors would pair well together?" No. No, this couldn't be. Not here, not on Terra. Not here, in the heart of the Ecclesiarchy's greatest temple. Impossible. Luha realized she had spoken the last word aloud when the towering creature cocked its elongated head to the side, the casual gesture obscenely revolting. It threw aside the bloody remains it had been playing with, its attention focusing on Luha. "Oh, but it is very much possible, sweetling." Its voice was like rotten honey and silk. "It wasn't easy, of course. I could never have done it without you." "What?" The single word was all Luha could manage to get out. "You brought me in, my dear," it said, pointing at the ruined coffin beneath its legs. "You and your dear sisters. Then, when the explosives my servants had put inside exploded, you were the first to spill blood." It called to the old power that has echoed on this blighted world for millennia, cowed by that awful light. But the light, well. The light has fallen dark, sweetling. And so I rose, from the hallowed flesh of one of the Dark Prince's champions. And no. This can't be. Saint Rodrigo. Dear Rodrigo was ours, the daemon delightfully explained. He was always ours. I could carve his sins into the walls of this false temple and run out of space before I was halfway done. He lied and seduced, and spread his corruption across the clergy of entire sectors to help his own elevation. He was a prophet, but one pledged to the Prince of Pleasure and Pain, and for his devotion, he was rewarded with this final opportunity to serve, even in death. "You lie," she croaked out. "Do I?" Its smiled revealed teeth of perfect white embedded with jewels that gleamed with the light of shrieking souls. "Perhaps I do. After all, your scriptures tell you that I and all my brethren are creatures of deceit and treachery. But answer me this, sweetling. If I am lying, then how am I here?" It extended its forearms, gesturing to their surroundings. "This is Terra," it said, purring the name of the Holy Throne World with sickening fondness. "Not since great Gilliman himself has my kind walked upon this world." "The Emperor protects," Luha whispered. "You cannot be here. His light will consume you." "Your god is dead," laughed the monstrosity. "There is no one left to hear your prayers." No. No, it couldn't be true. She refused to believe it. And yet, something had changed. Something she had felt since her ship had emerged from the warp at the border of Sol, something she hadn't even noticed was there, suddenly had vanished. Could it be? No. No, it was heresy to merely think it, to even consider it possible. "You are starting to see," cooed the Keeper of Secrets. "Yet you still refuse the truth, still cling to the lies. How disappointing, sweetling. But I am not an ungrateful creature. You will live, little Luha. You will live to see all the lies you dedicated yourself to cast down, to witness the light's end and the angels rise. You will live to behold the true meaning of glory." Luha ran, her mind awash with horror, the monster's laughter following behind her. "Run. Run, sweetling. As fast as you can, as far as you dare. In the end, it will change nothing." She screamed and stumbled, pushing aside the pilgrims and other servants of the creed from her path with her armor-augmented strength. They did not resist her, their minds too caught in the awful sounds and lights emanating from the cathedral. "The anathema is dead," mocked the daemon. "Soon, this entire world will be our playground. So run, sweetling. It will make the chase all the more intoxicating." And as Sister Luha ran from the cathedral of the immortal emperor, Kaolith the Prurient, keeper of secrets of the youngest god, returned to its gory work of desecration. Amidst the blood of hundreds of pilgrims, it called to the echoes that slumbered within the collective psyche of Terra, and drew them forth in all their horror and magnificence. Its sculptures of flesh began to twitch, as infernal intelligences flowed through them and claimed them as their own. One by one, these possessed constructs tore themselves free of Kaolith's great work, and turned stolen eyes upon the rest of the horrified pilgrims, who had finally begun to run from the nightmare that had manifested itself within the cathedral of the immortal emperor. Screams of pain mixed with those of terror and madness, a discordant note among the never-ending chorus of prayers and chimes that filled the territory of the ecclesiarchy on Terra. Innocent. We were so blind in the beginning, explained Malusis. His voice was warm, friendly even. It made the screams of the man he was flaying alive sound all the more horrible in contrast. The man in the Chaos Lord's care had once been the governor of this world, which was known to the Imperium as Hadron's Standing. In truth, considering the small size of the world's population, which was restricted to a single city, located atop the only mountain that rose above the flesh-dissolving clouds of burning chemicals that covered the rest of the world, calling him a mayor rather than a governor would have been more appropriate, but the administratum was ever a stickler for proper procedure. Now the city burned, for the Chaos Marines who called themselves the Innocent had come. Their warships had destroyed what few orbital defenses the system had with ease, and the planetary defense forces had been no match for their ruthless onslaught. Nothing now remained to stand against the Asteroutes in garish armor and silver masks. I was one of the first, Malusis continued, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. At the time, there were only 8 of us, a band of vagabonds and exiles, brought together by the vagaries of the Long War. Myself, I was from the 8th Legion, banished by my brothers because I had become a little too enthusiastic in my work for their taste. Well, I say banished, they tried to kill me, but I managed to escape. We were so petty back then. So obsessed with our own grievances and sins. Even I was trapped in it, always wondering if my brothers didn't have a point, if I wasn't the monster they had accused me of being. I kept telling myself that what I had done in the name of justice, that they had just not been willing to go far enough to ensure proper punishment was doled out. Malusis laughed, the sound rich and joyous. Can you imagine, my friend? The sheer arrogance of it. To think that I somehow held in my head the truth of justice and punishment. Foolish, really. But such were our ways back then. We were lost and blind, and we did not even know it. Anyway, the 8 of us were wandering across the galaxy, fleeing from our various foes and searching for opportunity. Our ship at the time was quite a piece of junk, and its engines broke down while we were in warp transit, forcing us to exit the Empyrean immediately and trust into the mercy of the gods. The first sign we were blessed was that we did not re-enter the Materium within the heart of a star or in the middle of an asteroid field. Indeed, we appeared instead within a solar system, one with an inhabited world. While our servants worked on repairing the engines, me and the rest of our group went to investigate the planet. Our auspexes detected no true technology, but we were hoping to at least replenish the ranks of our slaves from the local population. And we did, but we also found much, much more. It turned out that the system had been cut out from the rest of the galaxy for thousands of years. The human population had long since forgotten everything about their origins, and had begun to worship the ruinous powers in exchange for their blessings, which they needed in order to survive on their beast-infested world. With the power bestowed upon them by the dark gods, they had built great cities in the middle of the jungles, sealed off from the vegetation by high walls. Of course, those did nothing to stop us in our gunship. He laughed again, briefly lost in the fond memory. The natives welcomed us as gods, and brought us into their greatest temple. There were carvings on the walls, centuries old, that depicted me and my brothers. Their priests had known, long before any of us was even born, that we would come here one day. All of their priests wore masks like this one, he continued, gesturing at his face with a hand holding a knife dripping with blood. Like the other Asteroutes amidst the smoking ruins of Hadron's Standing, his helmet was partially fused with a silver mask of exquisite detail that covered the upper half of his face completely. And they offered us our own, which had been forged especially for us according to their ancient prophecies. At the time, we tried to refuse. We were suspicious of their sorcery, and none of us trusted prophecies. As I said before, we were fools. The priests had no choice but to force us to stand still using their enforcers, huge brutes bloated with the power of the dark gods, before applicating the masks onto our faces. And then we saw. He sighed. It was like nothing else, my friend. We saw the silver palace of the youngest god, Slaanesh, the profligate one, lord of pleasure and pain. We saw all of the 6 courts of sensation, all of the holy debaucheries and perversions that the daemons of Slaanesh bestow upon the chosen souls of those who served the prince in life. It was then that we understood. There is no sin, you see, only power. The warp responds to our deeds, but it does not judge them, and what greater authority can there be than the total sum of every ensouled creature that has ever lived and will ever live? And if there can be no sin then we must, each and every one of us, be innocent. The Chaos Lord chuckled. It was that revelation that led to us taking our new names. We began to call ourselves the Innocent, and we went on to spread the gift of our understanding to others. Because you see, my friend, the more of our brothers we illuminate, the more powerful the Innocent become, and the more powerful our warband becomes, the more each of us becomes in turn, since we are part of the whole. He frowned. Are you following me, my friend? I fear your attention may have wandered. Here, let me help you focus. With his free hand, Mallusus pulled out the flayed man's eyes, his armored fingers digging into the soft tissues of the eyeballs and cracking the bones around them. Throwing the bloody mess aside, he continued. We took the priests with us to the stars, that they may craft new masks for us to bestow. For you see, the more of us there are, the better we can do the work we know must be done, the destruction of all artifices, of all the lies of laws and morality that bind the truth of human nature. We are all of us free, or we are none of us free, or something like that. I admit that my skill at expressing the truth of our illumination isn't up to the task yet. The flayed governor finally sighed his last breath, his tortured heart giving up from the sheer amount of pain he was experiencing. Mallusus patted the bloody corpse on the head. Thank you for the opportunity to practice, friend. Turning away from his victim, the Chaos Lord smiled as the ashes of Hadron's standing fell upon him in a black snow. Deep within, part of him screamed in horror, guilt, and shame, but the silver mask on his face drained those feelings from him, sucking them dry like a psychic tick. Lord Mallusus, called one of his brothers. Look up. We have company. From the ash-filled skies, a golden being was descending on shining wings. For just by looking at it, Mallusus could tell that this creature was beyond such concepts as gender, landed amidst the forest of spikes, and none of the Innocent or their servants dared to stand in its way as it slowly made its way toward Mallusus himself. The Chaos Lord could feel the power radiating from the entity. He recognized it, from stories swapped by the followers of the ruinous powers. This was the Sanguiner, the Golden Herald of the Shattered Ninth Legion. Yet it was said to walk the galaxy accompanied by a retinue of blood angels, and none of those vampiric Astaroths were in sight, save for the few who already wore the Innocent's masks. Lord Mallusus, the winged figure said, its voice projected directly into the Chaos Lord's mind. I have come to offer you a chance to fulfill your purpose. To strike at the very heart of those who enforce the lies of the false emperor, at the forge where the hidden blades of tyranny are crafted. Where the greatest hypocrisy of the Imperium resides, where mortals are made to know nothing but death, yet are shackled with the lie of justice. And what, Golden One, would you ask of the Innocent in return? Only that you do as you will, once you are brought across. Is that not the only thing one can ask of another? Mallusus considered the offer. His mind had changed a great deal since the days he had fought under the banner of the King of the Night, twisted first by hatred and a hunger for suffering, then by the sorcery of the mask that had been forced upon him. Like all the Innocent, he thought in strange and cruel ways, alien to those who did not share the Warband's madness. I accept, he finally said. The Innocent gathered their forces, an army of Chaos Marines, tanks, and mortal cultists. The mask crafters were brought from their ships in orbit, for the Sanguiner had told Mallusus that they would be delivered directly before the walls of their despised foe, and the Innocent would not leave the ones who had illuminated them behind. Each of the holy artisans was surrounded by a ring of bodyguards, mortal champions of chaos who had proven strong enough to survive the power of the silver masks themselves. Of course, unlike the Innocent, they could not truly withstand the awesome power of illumination, and were reduced to little more than vessels for the power of truth. Malicious drank from the sanguineer's cup, and felt the metal of his mask burn as the liquid touched it on its way to his lips. "The bargain is sealed," declared the sanguineer. "Let the angels' will be done." The ashes of Hadron's standing rose up at once in a great black cloud, and rushed on the innocent from all sides. Malicious heard the mortals cry out in fear as they were engulfed. His sight was obscured, and he heard something like glass breaking in the distance. When the blackness receded, the innocent stood beneath another sky, smoking rubble under their feet. Absently, Malicious noted the 6 corpses laid around him in a circle, and the blood pattern traced upon the piece of stone on which he stood, the only piece left intact of whatever structure their arrival had destroyed. But before he could wonder if those were the fools who had helped the sanguineer bring the innocent across, his eyes fell upon the cathedral before them. It seemed ordinary, no different from all the others in the distance. But Malicious knew, merely by looking at it. He could sense what laid within, the power and the obscene lies that were embedded in the very stone of that fortress of abominations. He could taste the pretense of justice, the abdication of free will in the name of a so-called greater purpose. For the first time since he had put on the silver mask that had broken whatever shred of nobility had remained within him, the former Night Lord felt hatred. He raised his hands in the air, holding his demonic axe for all of his assembled forces to see. "Let there be no sin!" he shouted, the war cry echoed by thousands of throats. "Let there be only innocence!" There was a great roar, as hundreds of silver masks pulsed with warp energy, infusing their wearers with renewed strength and purpose through the same link that let them bleed their hosts dry of guilt and shame. The unholy artifacts bit deeper into the flesh of the Chaos Marines, and their baleful influence spread to the mortal army arrayed at their sides, infusing them with the same relentless purpose, the same complete absence of conscience. And so the innocent went forth, to assault the Assassinorum Temple, while the angel war unfolded across Seoul. Mark. Mining Outpost XNU 17649, nicknamed Xanadu by the workers who mined the rare materials found within the earth of the lifeless world of Karakos, was almost completely cut off from the rest of the galaxy. Like the other mining outposts scattered across the world's surface, the few hundred miners, support, and security personnel lived underground, breathing recycled air and drinking water that had passed through thousands of bodies before. Their only contact with the greater Imperium was the shuttle that came once a month to take the output of the mine and deliver supplies, parts, and occasionally replacement personnel, culled from the rest of the system. At first, no one could understand the voices. No one even acknowledged them, though everyone could hear them. After the first murder, the authorities claimed the voices weren't voices, but a shift in atmospheric pressure due to a benign fault in the air recyclers that caused bizarre winds. Nothing to worry about, they claimed, and anyone saying otherwise was clearly subversive. There were a few arrests, a public execution when the murderer was identified, and no one spoke of the voices aloud anymore. They weren't that bad, after all, once you got used to it. Like a sad, mournful song that followed the workers everywhere, from their small, cramped quarters to the mining tunnels. Then came the graffiti, carved in the walls of tight corridors with mining tools. The enforcers cracked down hard to find the perpetrator, eventually dragging one of the oldest miners out of his hab cell. The man screamed and raved as he was arrested, claiming he was writing the words of the voices and that the crime must be carried on. After being declared insane, he was executed and the defaced wall covered. But less than 10 days later, the same markings were found in 3 separate locations of XNU 17649. This time, the culprits were the workers who had repaired the previous damage. Showing surprising intuition, the overseer used a servitor to repair the damaged walls and sent the 3 workers to the infirmary. When the next shuttle lifted off, it carried a confidential report on what had happened at Xanadu, as well as a request for replacement workers, and the drugged bodies of the latest offenders. The story could have ended there, at least until the voices of Karakos drove another miner of Xanadu mad. But the report sent by the conscientious overseer included a picture of the markings, taken by the optics of the servitor that had repaired the damage. At the time, the overseer had thought nothing of it. Clearly the madness was caused by some sort of pathogen that had been left at the site of the first marking by the initial vandal. The trio he had sent away were quarantined as best they could, and since the medical personnel showed no symptom, these measures were enough to keep the contagion in check, even if they hadn't been able to identify its source with their limited equipment. The picture was only included in the report for the sake of completeness. The first official to see the report destroyed the pictures, poisoned the 3 comatose patients in their sleep, and sent replacements to Xanadu along with reassuring platitudes that the matter was being investigated. She then ventured to the nearby spaceport and spent a night with a ship officer on shore leave, whispering the song of Xanadu in his ear as he slept. The day after he left the planet to return to his ship, she killed herself, erasing the last trace of the mark of Xanadu in the system. From that point onward, the curse of Xanadu moved from host to host, from ship to ship, leaving behind a trail of dead bodies and ruined souls. From star system to star system, from sector to sector, from segmentum to segmentum, always escaping notice, never infecting more than a single soul at a time. It buried itself within the masses of mankind, until finally, it reached Terra, carried there by an Auspex officer on a pilgrim ship. A confession passed the curse to an ecclesiarchy priest, who inscribed the mark upon a scroll of parchment he sent to an administratum drone along with a list of requirements for the upcoming celebrations of the millennium's end. From there it spread upward the administratum's labyrinthine chain of command, until it finally reached its intended target, an unassuming scribe responsible for one of the many demonstrations planned for the celebrations. As the last hours of the year ticked by, 1,000,000 pilgrims were herded onto a vast plaza, located amidst the sprawling spires of what had once been called Europa. Each was given a colored uniform and a position to stand on. Seen from above, they were supposed to form the image of the Aquila, golden on a crimson background. There they would listen to the speech from the ecclesiarch, the first of the new millennium, as he spoke to the faithful from a balcony located high above the gathered crowd. Baldo Slyst, the current high priest of the Adeptus Ministorum, had ordered the spectacle as a display of his influence and prestige, to reinforce the impact of his message as it was broadcast across Terra. Doing this here instead of on the southern continent of Australia, where the ecclesiarchy's headquarters on Terra were located, was a power move, designed to show to the other High Lords that the influence of the Imperial Creed stretched all over the throne world. It was also part of the Alpha Legion's plan to have faith across the planet at an all-time high in order to facilitate the ascension of the Emperor to godhood. But instead, when the pilgrims massed into the plaza and found their assigned spots, they formed the mark of Xanadu, and the image was broadcast across half a continent. It only lasted for a few moments, as the instant the Alpha Legion operatives shadowing the ecclesiarch saw the icon and turned the broadcast down, their hexagrammatic protection tattoos burning upon their skin as they fought off the corruption, which had thankfully been diluted by being so widespread. Even so, millions were afflicted, none worse than those who had made up the crowd shaping the unholy sigil. Those clad in crimson, whose bodies had formed the sigil upon a golden backdrop, ignited in warp fire, forming a single blazing rune while those around them screamed in agony, their bodies melting from the inside as lesser spawns of the Dark Prince manifested through them. Amidst this madness rose the Keeper of Secrets Conothera, which had not walked the Materium in 10,000 years. During the Roboutian Heresy, Conothera had been unleashed upon the galaxy by daemonists of the 9th Legion, and reaped a harvest of pain and ruin until it had been destroyed on Karakos by the Grey Knights during the Scouring, its power broken and its essence shattered. Karakos had been razed in the process, its once thriving civilization reduced to ash in the conflict between daemon and knight, their souls either released from their flesh or consumed by the Neverborn. By decree of the Secretive Chapter, the world had then been declared forbidden to all, but humanity's memory was a fragile thing. In time, the interdiction had been forgotten, and the planet had been colonized anew. Slowly, the petty sins and lusts of the miners had fed the lingering echoes of Conothera, and its ghost had sung to them, inscribing its name upon their souls until it had been carried all the way to Terra, just in time for Light's end. Who can say how the decree was forgotten? The labyrinthine bureaucracy of the administratum is beyond the ability of any to comprehend. Yet surely this was no mere coincidence, but the work of a dark power, seeking to bring a powerful peace to Terra as the rest of its schemes unfolded. Conothera drew the souls of the lost to it, and from them shaped its incarnate form, tall and magnificent. It fixed its baleful gaze upon Slyst, who still stood on the balcony, horrified at what he was beholding. For all the ecclesiarch's ambition and pride, however, his faith in the God Emperor was strong, and neither the greater daemon's manifestation nor the blazing mark of Xanadu had been enough to corrupt him. Kanathara saw this, and felt anger that a soul would dare reject its magnificence. The Keeper of Secrets raised one of its blades, and the horde of daemons surrounding it rushed forward, climbing up the walls of the cathedral from where the ecclesiarch had intended to give his sermon. Finally breaking from their shock, Slyst's guards took their charge away, but Kanathara itself moved in, leaping hundreds of meters up from the plaza and landing on the balcony with impossible grace. Bathed in the greater daemon's unholy presence, many of the ecclesiarch's defenders succumbed, falling to their knees in adoration, not noticing the razor-sharp talons of the entity's minions as they cut their throats. Kanathara strode forth, cutting down any who remained standing, until it came face to face with Baldo Slyst. The ecclesiarch, his ancient heart nearly bursting with terror, did not turn tail and run, futile as it would have been. With prayer and rosaries, he castigated the greater daemon, invoking the name of the God Emperor and his saints, and the holy ground upon which the cathedral had been built. And there was power behind his words, which burned Kanathara's perfect skin, leaving scorch marks upon its flesh. Yet all that accomplished was enraging the Keeper of Secrets further, and it fell upon the ecclesiarch with terrible oaths of agony leaving its needle-fanged mouth. Slyst's death was neither swift nor painless. But until the end, the ecclesiarch refused to break. As the holy ground was defiled with the blood of a high lord of Terra, Kanathara, he whose hooves shatter mountains and whose voice lulls the sun, laughed, and raised up a claw upon which was impaled Slyst's decapitated head. The cathedral trembled, the ancient structure unable to cope with the greater daemon's warping presence now that its awful power was unopposed. Pillars tumbled and archways collapsed, burying hundreds of maddened pilgrims under rubble. Brass arrows flared with warp fire, and silver and gold melted to form obscene patterns. Kanathara turned its back on the desolation it had made and looked down upon the plaza, where newly converted cultists and daemons were cavorting madly. It smiled, and looked up at the skies. They were full of smoke and pollution, reflecting the billion lights of the throne world. As it is below, it whispered in a voice that made the broken statues of saints weep black tears across the entire ruined cathedral, so it shall be above. It raised all four of its arms in celebration, mocking the similar gesture Slyst had performed on the balcony not a few minutes before. Hail the coming of the true God's children! Hail the angel of Slaanesh! Regal! They had been sons of Horus once. It was difficult for Lord Kostos to remember the days before he and his brothers had been trapped into the Empyrean. So much had been lost, and so much more had changed. They were none of them the men they had been when the ship that had become the splendid procession had been lost, her Gellerfield breaking down under the ceaseless assault of the warp. Even the name that the ship had borne before was now lost to her master, as he stood on her bridge, gazing into the many-hued storm ahead. But he did remember that, once, they had fought and bled under the banner of the 16th Legion, bearing the eye of the first War Master and the number of their company, of which he had been captain. He could not, however, remember the number of that company, nor did he remember any of the battles they had waged under that name. He wanted to. He felt that he should remember it, even if he had forgotten almost everything else. He forced himself to focus, to cling to the few threads of memories that lingered within him. His surroundings faded from his perception as he turned his mind inward, and eventually. 36, he thought. Yes, that had been the number. The 36th company of the Sons of Horus. There was symbolism in that, 6 times 6, the sacred number of the youngest god. Was something as simple as this the reason we were damned? Kostos wondered. Perhaps. The ways of the warp were not for mere mortals to understand, and despite everything that had been done to him, Kostos still stubbornly clung to his mortality, even as he and his brothers had been all but completely stripped of it. The warp storm that had claimed the splendid procession had been unlike anything any of them had ever experienced, beyond anything recorded in the ship's archives. Perhaps, during the Roboutian Heresy itself, there had been forces that had encountered worse tides, but Kostos doubted it. They had been dragged from the immaterium and into the realms of chaos themselves, the hellscapes shaped by the subconscious darkness of every soul that had ever lived. They had emerged from the storm and into the domains of the ruinous powers. They had sailed the sea of blood, where the vitae of Kern's victims flowed endlessly and sharks the size of continents bit at one another in frenzied hunger. They had fought off borders of silver and fire amidst the crystal towers of the labyrinth of Tsianch. They had burned their way through the garden of Nergal, and slain the 7 daemon princes the grandfather had sent to punish them at the cost of 100 brothers. And then they had come to the silver palace of the youngest god, and their doom had found them. The procession had been becalmed, trapped within the honeyed maze of promises and lies that sprung around the courts of pleasure and pain. The Space Marines had prepared to die at the hands of the infinite demonic horde waiting outside, but instead, only 2 emissaries had been sent. Calling themselves Agony and Ecstasy, the 2 creatures had offered a single choice to the lost company, to die valiantly but for nothing, or to take up the challenges set before them by the courts. They had made it sound as if it were an honor they had been selected for, rather than the cruel whim of a dark god. Of course, they had been lying, it had not been a choice at all. No sooner had they spoken that Kostos and his brothers had been dragged out of the splendid procession by sorcery, separated and thrown into 100 different arenas, for that was what they had been, even if some of them had looked like exquisite gardens and courts. Though Kostos had known better than to vainly rail against this breach of their word, the 2 daemons had mocked him relentlessly as he underwent his own trials. They had stopped laughing when he had watched them ripped apart after an eternity spent navigating the intrigues of the sense-weight courts, finally succeeding in making them run afoul of a greater power. And so it had been for each of his brothers, trapped within the realms of chaos. Here, each of them alone and surrounded by monsters in beautiful disguise, they had been made to play their part in the drama of the Slaaneshi aristocracy. They had been servants and knights, champions and villains, strangers and old friends, even, Kostos knew to his eternal disgust, lovers to some of the abominations. Had any of this been real and not an illusion conjured by the Empyrean? Kostos had no way of knowing. But the effects on him and his brothers had been all too real. The warp had hollowed them, taken pieces of their souls and replaced them with stories woven of infernal whispers. Bit by bit, slowly enough that each individual violation left them virtually unchanged, until only the shape remained of who they had been, a vessel for the creatures they had become. They had lost their names and received titles in exchange, symbolizing the power they had been given as well as incarnating the shackles that had been put around their souls. For these titles were in truth the roles they played in the strange and insane theater of the Dark Prince's courts, and they had been bestowed with little regard for how well they fit. Instead, it had been the recipients of those mantles that had been altered to fit them. When they had reached the end of their stories, the Space Marines had been brought back to the splendid procession, except that they weren't Space Marines any longer. Kostos had been the first to be sent back, and he had watched with growing horror as the rest of his company returned. He saw his librarian, a noble and proud warrior who had held the amethyst gate of Nephrarius against the tyrannid onslaught for 7 hours on his own, reduced to a shadow-shrouded figure calling itself the Thief of Faces. He saw his company champion, who had dueled an Imperial Fist heretic to the death and in victory broken the back of the radio's incursion, return as the star-eyed swordsman. On and on, he had witnessed his brothers come back and take up their old chambers within the procession, and watched as they created something akin to the infernal courts they had departed from the mortal crew. Of his entire company, Kostos alone had retained his name, and with it his mortality. He was the linchpin of the Regal Company, its last remaining tie to the Materium. This was not by coincidence, he knew, for through his old rank he held some authority over the entire company, no matter how changed they were. Even as they plotted and schemed, pitting their minions against each other in petty power plays, none of them had ever conspired against him. Now, at last, that design was revealed to him. As the last of his brothers, the empty-hearted soldier, was returned to him and the chains holding the splendid procession in place came loose, the Golden Herald had come for them, and offered a path out of the sea of souls, if they would but do one last favor for it and the one it served. And, gods take him, but Kostos had been so tired of it all that he had accepted what he knew to be a devil's bargain. He had accepted the proffered cup, and drunk from it, sealing the pact between the Regals and the Sanguiner. You shall be regal and terrible, the Golden Herald had told him, and bring forth the wrath of the true gods upon those who have sought to defy their dominion for 100 centuries. And so the 36th Company of the Sons of Horus, lost to the warp 1,000 years ago, returned to the Materium on the edge of the Sol system, to join into the final and most terrible play that was the Angel War. The splendid procession burst from the warp deep within Sol, far beyond the Mandeville Point and its many strongholds keeping watch for any invasion. Across the halls of the procession, the Regals stirred. They called for their titleless servants, descendants of the ship's original mortal crew. They too had been reshaped by their long journey, transformed over the course of generations into eyeless, furtive creatures that spent their entire lives serving as incubators for the nightmarish warp spawns dwelling within their mutated genes. Suddenly cut off from the immaterium for the first time in their wretched existences, the titleless screamed and twisted. Most perished within seconds of the battle barge leaving the warp, but those who survived blossomed into new and wondrous shapes as the potential they held within them was forced to actualize. An army of mutants was birthed in the holds of the splendid procession, each and every one of them still bound to the titled marine who had held their loyalty in their mortal life. And as the Regals called, the titleless answered, a horde of souls lost to beasthood and madness, rushing to the command of beings who had been heroes and were now naught but puppets of a cruel and uncaring prince. Let this sordid tale end at last, thought the demmed lord of the Regals, who had once been called Kostos, but who was now just as lost as his brothers. Only enough remained of who he had been to feel horror and disgust at what they had become, and to long for an end to their torment. Let us all burn and be done with it. The splendid procession, driven by the bargain sealed between its master and the sanguinary, coursed through the void, followed by a trail of boiling warp energy. Like an arrow loosed from the quiver with perfect aim, it shot straight between void fortresses and orbital defenses, toward its target. Titan, the Saturnian moon where the hallowed and secretive Grey Knights had made their home. Signal 997.M41, Solar Segmentum, Deep Space. They had taken a forgotten symbol of the triumph of science and discovery, and made it into an abomination. The disciples of blessed numerology had been forced to flee their home worlds when their sector-wide conspiracy to use the very architecture of their hives to bring forth a series of warp storms had been unmasked by the Ordo Hereticus. After spending the better part of 3 centuries engineering the civil wars that had left the hives desperately needing rebuilding and infiltrating the great reconstruction projects, all it had taken to bring the disciples down had been a single acolyte stumbling upon evidence that someone was blackmailing one of the administrative officials in charge of the assignment, and it had all unraveled from there. Most of the sect had been decimated in the following purges, but a not inconsequential number had managed to escape, using the ships of their most wealthy members. They had taken along with them most of their unholy research, as well as the abominable thinking engine they had crafted from the brains of their own members whose bodies had reached the end of their natural lifespan. Despite their exile, the disciples had kept heart, for as they fled from the Holy Ordo's fury, they had received visions of a great, golden being, that had whispered into their souls secrets far greater than any they had uncovered in their generations of plumbing the depths of sorcery through the forbidden arithmetics of the Empyrean. This being had set them on a quest that would earn them the eternal favor of the Dark Prince, who in their quest for mathematical transcendence of the mundane world the disciples had served for centuries. The first of the secrets the disciples had received as a set of coordinates located within the solar segmentum, far from any known star system. Their navigators hadn't survived the rigors of the journey for long, as they were forced to sail beyond the reach of the Astronomicon to avoid detection. When they had died, their souls sucked from their bodies by the nameless horrors of the primordial sea, the disciples had stepped up, using their unholy calculations to divine a path through the eternal storms raging in the depths of the Empyrean. After years of travel, which left their already threadbare sanity in even worse shape, the disciples reached their destination, and forced their ships out of the warp. The brutality with which they did this, in order to be as close to their target as possible, broke their warp engines beyond all hopes of repair with the resources they had available, leaving them stranded, but they did not care. For on their Auspex, they had found what they had been looking for, the ancient artifact that would help them achieve their golden patron's command. The object was small, barely a few meters wide. It was an inclined disk, to which were attached devices of inconceivable age. Though the metal had been bathed in cosmic radiation for tens of thousands of years, the faintest trace of letters could be discerned on its base, written in a language that had been dead long before the Emperor had begun his crusade. Voyager 1, said those markings. The disciples began their work at a frenetic pace. Cladding themselves in void suits, they built a workshop around the antediluvian device. They could not bring it aboard their ships, it was too old, too frail, and such an action would have undone the very conditions that made it a key part of their patron's designs. In the cogitator rooms of their becalmed ships, the disciples calculated the distance between their current position and Sol, using the distant light of the throne world to determine the current and future position of each of the system's spheres. Even as life supports began to shut down, they continued their calculations, transmitting the results to those working directly on the artifact so that they would adjust its position and alignment with their bare, void-bitten hands. For months, the disciples worked, constructing an array of unholy technology around the ancient probe. They transformed it into an infernal broadcast engine, mixing the ancient technology, which was, by the standards of the Imperium, incredibly primitive, with the mysteries of ruinous engineering. Even as their supplies of food, water, and even air started to run out, they continued their work, driven beyond fear by the compulsion that devoured their minds, the all-consuming obsession to see their work reach completion, whatever the cost. Other disciples worked on preparing the message that would be broadcast. They contemplated the mysteries of chaos, piecing together the unholy knowledge bestowed upon them by their patron. Each of the disciples had been granted a single syllable of the dark god's own dread language, and it was their task to extract this dark truths from the depths of their own shriven souls to combine the fragments into one terrible whole. They desecrated the bodies of their own dead to force their departed spirits to return in order to interrogate them and recover the fragments that they had received. Through the techniques developed by the sect over the centuries, they pieced together the true name of one of the Dark Prince's greatest servants, and put it down in a format that could be transmitted across interstellar distances. And now, at long last, the work was done. All members of the blessed numerology cut their own throats, releasing their souls at the precise moment the device they had crafted unleashed its payload into the void. Their deaths granted additional strength to the transmission, and their souls were welcomed into the Silver Palace, where their rewards awaited them. Whether those rewards were anything like what they had imagined, none but the Dark Prince would ever know. The deep signal's emission obliterated the device that had broadcast it, shattering the 40,000 years old relic at its core in the process. The warp boiled with the power unleashed in this single, focused beam, but so far from any soul, so far from any of the warp roots, no one would pick up on it until it was much, much too late. For 820 days, the deep signal crossed the void, unheard by any soul. Until, carried by the cosmic waves, it hit its intended target, the small planetoid at the edge of the Sol system that, in ages past, human scholars had debated whether it deserved the classification of planet or not. Through the calculations of the disciples of blessed numerology, the deep signal had hit the precise point it needed to. Despite the unimaginable distance between Voyager 1 and the frozen orb, thanks to their God-given obsession with mathematical perfection, the disciples had accomplished their appointed task. On Pluto, in the pits where the Ninth Legion had battled monsters at the dawn of the Great Crusade, the cultists of the Gifted Tithe sacrificed 666 newborn to the one they called Glorious. The sheer monstrosity of the deed, which was the culmination of weeks of ritual debaucheries held in secret within the depths of the frozen world, lit a spark in the ether. That spark drew the deep signal to it, and what had only been nightmarish potential became reality. Flesh ran like wax. The corpses of sacrificed infants melted together, providing the matter from which arose a powerful daemon, brought forth from the Empyrean by its true name embedded within the deep signal. The cultists of the Gifted Tithe were engulfed in the tide of flesh, their souls devoured by that which they had called forth. And so, the creature that was known in the darkest myths of the children of Isha as Ziraat, the Song of the Deep, was reborn in all its awful glory. In the sealed records of the Black Library, Ziraat's legend was inscribed in silver letters upon psi-neutral scrolls. According to those records, the being that would become Ziraat actually predated the birth of She Who Thirsts, having coalesced into the Empyrean from the narcissism and perversions of a particularly depraved segment of the Eldar Empire. Only when Slaanesh itself had risen from the fall had the Song of the Deep been brought to heel by the greater power, forced to submit and assimilate into the courts of sensation. By the Dark Prince's awful will, it had been stripped of much of its strength and transformed into one of Slaanesh's keepers of secrets, yet even after its diminishment, Ziraat had remained one of that terrible kind's foremost members. So powerful was Ziraat, in fact, that never had it been brought into the Materium before, never had it been summoned by deluded cultists or unleashed upon a doomed world by a warp storm. Yet now, at Light's End, the Song of the Deep would be heard. For such was the will of the disciples of blessed numerology's patron, who had heard the secret of Ziraat's true name from the very lips of the profligate one. In Pluto's depths it rose, immense and terrible, opened all of its 6 mouths wide, and began to sing the song that would end the world. Ziraya's voice echoed across the tunnels of Pluto, and all who heard it went mad. The whole of Pluto became a kingdom of the lost and the damned, every heartbeat seeing it plunge further and further, ever closer to becoming a fully fledged daemon world. Ziraya sang, and reality screamed under the strain of the deep signal's true form. Nearby ships patrolling the Mandeville Point or just arriving into Seoul heard the song over Vox or into their heads, and they too were lost. Merchant and pilgrim vessels veered off course toward the frozen world, while aboard them navigators and psychically sensitive individuals were turned inside out to provide gateways for manifested neverborn called forth by the song of the deep to join in the celebrations. Ziraya sang, and in the Silver Palace, sat upon a throne fashioned from the souls of its victims, Slaanesh smiled in nostalgia, and hummed along the tune. Tyrant. When the Eye of Terror first opened, hundreds and hundreds of worlds were dragged within its baleful embrace. The core worlds of the Eldar Empire, home to uncounted trillions of children of Isha, were swallowed by the hungry mouth of the Sea of Souls. In the first of the ages that followed, the Eye belonged to the dark god it had spawned, and its legions of newly created children. The daemons of Slaanesh ruled over every world within the Eye of Terror, and they wrought wonders and horrors alike from the ruins of the fallen empire. But soon, the forces of the three elder powers arrived, for none of the dark gods could ever tolerate their youngest sibling to hold such vast territory unchallenged. And so, long before Gilliman raised his flag of rebellion and condemned 8 of the 9 legions to rally to it to exile within the Eye, the ruinous powers sent their champions, mortal and immortal, to the greatest warp storm in the galaxy. On every world of the Eye, the scions of the Dark Prince were attacked by the hordes of Kern, Tzeentch, and Nurgle, and they were forced to relinquish countless domains to their rivals. Since then, the Eye of Terror has been in a perpetual state of flux, with the forces of the Dark Gods fighting each other and daemon worlds constantly changing hands. And no world represented this state of affair better than Eidolon. Since the end of Slaaneshi hegemony, Eidolon had been in a constant state of warfare, as the forces of the Four battled for supremacy in an endless cycle. Always the world was divided between the territories of the 4 factions, each led by a powerful champion of that god. Always one would rise over its rivals, only to be cast down, whether by inner conflict, an alliance of the other powers, or the random whim of their patron god. This was as the gods willed it, for the struggle for Eidolon was much more entertaining to them as any of their champions' triumph could ever be. And so the cycle went on and on, the siren song of Eidolon driving billions of cultists and other denizens of the Eye to throw their lives away on its countless battlefields. But then had come Leon Atos. A former captain of the 9th Legion and powerful champion of Slaanesh, Leon Atos had risen to rule over the servants of the youngest god on Eidolon. From that point on, the influence of the Dark Prince on Eidolon had been on the ascendant, with Leon Atos even leading many incursions beyond the borders of the Eye using potent sorceries. For his deeds and monstrosity, he was rewarded with ascension, stripped of his mortality and elevated into the ranks of the Neverborn. From Eidolon his name spread, burrowing into the darkling souls of the Dark Prince's worshippers in the Eye of Terror and beyond. Within ruinous temples and secret alcoves, cultists of the Profligate One whispered that their hour had come, that with Leon Atos leading them, they would finally claim Eidolon for their own and remake it into a paradise of sensation and excess. But Leon Atos was no fool, despite his monstrous arrogance. He knew that many had risen before him on Eidolon, and they had all fallen in time. By studying the past of the daemon world, he had been able to put together that the gods simply did not want one of their champions to triumph on that endless battlefield. The Daemon Prince refused to let such an ignominious fate befall him, yet he also refused to simply enjoy his current dominion and not rise higher. For decades, he brooded in his palace, trying to find a way to conquer all of Eidolon without falling prey to the same fate that had befallen all of the daemon world's would-be conquerors. No solution presented itself, until one day, a visitor came to him. Clad in golden armor and carried on shining wings, the Sanguiner came to Eidolon, and whispered in the ear of Leon Atos. The Sanguiner told Leon Atos that it could help him conquer Eidolon, in return for a favor that would be repaid once the conquest was complete. The Daemon Prince knew better than to trust such an offer, but such was his desire to rule over all of Eidolon that he accepted the bargain, and drank from the Sanguiner's cup. With the Sanguiner's patronage, Leon Atos' fortunes soared. Daemons of Slaanesh answered his call in greater number, and war bands from all across the Eye flocked to his banner. Leaving his isolation, Leon Atos led his armies to victory after victory, expanding his territory rapidly until the lords of the other three powers allied against him. But even this wasn't enough to stop him, for Leon Atos had been marked with the favor of Slaanesh. In a final, climactic battle fought within the hive-sized bones of an ancient Leviathan, Leon Atos slew all three of his rivals and crowned himself tyrant of Eidolon. The temples and monuments of the rival powers were cast down, their followers slaughtered and their cities razed. Only those who converted to the worship of Slaanesh and his champion Leon Atos were spared. In the wake of Leon Atos' victory, the Sanguiner returned to Eidolon, entering the tyrant's palace without being noticed by any of its many defenders and slaves. Sat upon his throne, Leon Atos watched the Golden Angel approach with something resembling apprehension, wondering what price he would pay for his black heart's desire. For despite all the power he had gained from his victory and draining the blood of his rivals through his daemon sword, Leon Atos still knew that the Sanguiner's might surpassed his own, and that reneging on the dead ode could yet see him lose everything he had claimed. Yet when the Sanguiner told him what it expected of him, the Daemon Prince laughed, and the sound of it sent the slaves of his city to terrified tears. In the years that followed, Leon Atos put his new empire to work. Millions of slaves were sent to the ancient battlefields of Eidolon, covered with the debris of millennia of warfare. By the will of the tyrant, they dug out the Chaos Titans that had been felled over the centuries. Here techs brought from off-world or captured from the defeated kingdoms of Eidolon toiled upon these ruined god machines, combining forbidden sciences with unholy rituals to return them to life. Sacrifices were made to rekindle long-dead reactors, and broken cogitator banks were replaced by rows of daemon-possessed meat brains. The forges that had produced the weaponry needed for Eidolon's endless wars were repurposed to craft the colossal armaments required for the Titans, every piece of Titan-sized war gear blessed with the blood of thousands before it was fitted upon a god machine. As the bodies of the Chaos Titans were resurrected, new minds were prepared to control them. Gifted children were harvested across Eidolon and submitted to intense training regimens which were a nightmarish reflection of those employed by the Collegio Tita and ICA. Those who made it to the end of their training became princeps and moderati, though few were strong enough to retain their humanity and emerge dominant in the struggle against the Chaos Titans' infernal machine spirit. Most were instead subsumed into the Titans' consciousness, their bodies wasting away as their brains still performed their function as crew. And so, one by one, an entire legio's worth of Chaos Titans were brought back to service. The remnants of a machine that, in a previous epoch, had been an Imperator-class Titan were brought to Leon Atos himself, who infused his own essence within the great engine, raising it anew with his own power. His throne, along with the heart of his palace, was transferred stone by stone to the top of the Titan's immense form. The Titan was named, after its master, the Tyrant of Eidolon. On its left arm, the slaves of the Dark Mechanicum affixed a great hell cannon, and on its right they put a blade forged from a shard of a mountain of black crystal, covering its smooth surface with eldritch runes that marked 666 of the Dark Prince's secret names. In the mock battles conducted against those Titans that could not be rebuilt satisfactorily, it was discovered that the union between Daemon Prince and Titan ran so deep, Leon Atos could taste the blood of all who were slain by the corrupted god machine. As this continued, there were those in the Eye of Terror who sought to capture these Titans for their own ends. The times of ending were coming, and all from the Black Legion to the Salamanders, even, it was whispered, the Raven Guard itself, were gathering the weapons with which to claim the galaxy in the new age to come. Raiders came to Eidolon, and perished by the thousands, slaughtered by Leon Atos' servants or lost to the suddenly intensified warp currents around the Daemon world. Entire warbands vanished, their ships swallowed by the warp and subjected to unimaginable fates by the never-born hosts that the Sanguiner had set to protecting Eidolon. Only those who came to join Leon Atos' empire were spared, though even they were not guaranteed safe passage, only the absence of certain doom. Finally, as Light's End echoed and the Eye of Terror shook with the psychic quake of the Emperor's demise, the Tyrant of Eidolon gathered this host of god machines. At the feet of the demonic engines was a vast army of slaves, cultists, and warriors, led by the few blood angels loyal to Leon Atos. With a great strike of its blade, the Tyrant of Eidolon tore a great rift in the fabric of reality, and the horde marched through it. So potent was the blow that opened the way that Eidolon itself broke under its strength. As the Slaaneshi host departed, the Daemon world heaved and cracked. Unable to withstand the terrible energies unleashed, the earth parted and broke apart. Entire cities were laid to waste, and monuments to ruin that had stood since the eye first opened tumbled down. But neither Leonatos nor his patron cared, for the angel war beckoned, and with it the promise of ultimate victory in the great game. The tyrant led the way, crossing through the infinite madness of the warp, the awful will of Leonatos carving a path that his servants could use as he followed the great unlight that had been set across the soul system. For a timeless eternity the horde advanced, before finally emerging onto the sacred soil of Holy Terra itself. There, the tyrant of Eidolon sounded its horn, a great and terrible sound that promised the death of all who stood in its way. And as the rest of the Chaos Titans echoed the call of the greatest among them, they were answered from afar, as the ancient engines sworn to the throne world's defense responded to this invasion. Once more, the god machines marched to war, and humanity's birth world shook under their steps. Unity. 999.M41, Mars. 5 minutes to light's end. Over 2,000 kilometers to the south of Olympus Mons, an entire macroclade of the Martian Legion's Skitarii stood guard at one of the entrances to the underworld. More than 1,200 Skitarii of various types were arrayed in perfect formation, weapons held at the ready, while the heavy defenses that had been constructed over the millennia continued to keep watch over the tunnel that led into the Noctis Labyrinthus, gateway into the Hadesian kingdoms. The entrance itself was blocked by a 5-meter-thick circular adamantium door, connected to a system of pistons and gears that, while incredibly primitive by the standards of the Mechanic-Use, had the advantage of being completely disconnected from any network that those trapped on the other side could have attempted to hack in order to open it. While most of the Red Planet's armies had gone to wage war in the Hadesian kingdoms under the banner of the Martian host, there remained a need to guard the entrances of this underground realm and prevent any of the Heretics and their creations from escaping. In another army, this duty would have been seen as an insult to those it had been bestowed upon, a way to deny them the chance to participate in the final, apocalyptic battles of the Lie of Iron, that would see Mars freed of the taint of ruin forevermore. But the Skitarii were not blinded by thoughts of personal glory. All that mattered to them was to follow the Omniscia as well as made clear by the Martian collective and expressed through the voices of his tech priests. They were, all of them, cogs in the Mechanicus great engine, and they would not even consider bemoaning the task they had been given. Already knowledge of the great victory scored by the Martian host against the gathered forces of the Hadesian kingdoms had reached the macroclade, spread by their tech priest overseers so that they would know of the Mechanicus triumph. Yet that triumph had not lessened their vigilance, for along with it had come the collective's predictions that, as the Martian host continued its relentless purge of the Red Planet's underground, it was inevitable that some of the Heretics would try to escape to the surface. Rax 99, who by the grace of the machine god had been elevated to serve as primary alpha of the Skitarii Rangers Mani Please deployed, was not exactly nervous. In truth, the Skitarii could not experience such a state of being, and had been unable to for several decades now, since she had been chosen among the children of the Mechanicus thralls to become part of the Skitarii legions. But there was a sense of trepidation, as she considered the tactical implications of what was transpiring on the primary Forge world. 3 sons of the Omni's Sire had returned, after thousands of years of absence. And they had not gone to Terra, where the High Lords of the Imperium fussed over matters of influence and prestige. They had come to Mars, to help the Fabricator General and the Martian Collective, hallowed be their circuitry, and a war that had bled the Adeptus Mechanicus resources since the time of dividing itself, that which the Imperium called the Roboutian Heresy. Until the arrival of the Primarches in Olympus Mons and the marshalling of the Martian host, Rax 99 had not known of the Lie of Iron. She had fought against the spawn of the Hadesian kingdoms, but had not truly known the scale of the threat that lingered beneath Mars' sacred surface. Now she knew, because she had been granted access to that knowledge by the towering leader of the macroclade. Surrounded by cybernetic guardians, the emissary was huge. Their chassis was bristling with weapons and transmitters, and their presence flowed through the manifold of the entire macroclade, watching through the senses of every soldier of the machine god. Rax 99 did not know the name of the tech priest who was interred within the sarcophagus, who had made the sacrifice of separating themselves from the collective in order to oversee the defense of this entrance to the Hadesian kingdoms. They were simply called, the emissary, over the noosphere, and that was more than enough. The first sign of the attack came from the seismographs attached to the defense outpost. They picked up the vibrations indicating that a great many something were advancing through the tunnels. Rax 99 saw the data flow on her ocular display, and she felt something akin to worry as she noticed that whatever was advancing was making no effort to avoid the mines that the Mechanikus had placed as far down the tunnel as their servitors could go. It was as if the foe was simply throwing bodies at the mines until they were all gone. The macroclade immediately went to top readiness. Weapons were heated in preparation for battle, and generators were set to higher settings. Catechisms of the machine god were recited in binary, investing the Skitarii with the strength to do the omniscia as will. Rax 99 drew her weapons, checked the positioning and readiness of her command, and waited. Something struck the gate from the inside, and the sound of the impact shook the dust-covered metal plates on which the macroclade stood. None broke formation, and none stumbled. There was another, stronger blow, and the thick adamantium gate bent slightly outward. The third blow moved it slightly out of alignment, and the fourth ripped it out of its hinges. It fell slowly at first, before gaining speed and momentum and smashing onto the ground. While the gate was 5 meters thick, the hole it had been designed to block was 10 meters high. The spawn of the Hadesian kingdoms had to climb up to get out of the tunnel, but that didn't seem to stop them. The macroclade opened fire as the first heretic soldiers came into view. Even as they unleashed the omniscia's fury upon his foes, their optics scanned the enemy and sent the data to their overseers for analysis. Queries into the database of known Hadesian heresies came up empty. Whatever these creatures were, they had not been faced by the lie of Iron's enforcers before. As the Skitarii commander, Rax 99 was one of the first to receive the blessing of that precious data. She saw them from 100 different angles, along with the observations of the tech priests. Like the Skitarii themselves, they were unions of flesh and machines, but where the Skitarii hid their remaining flesh under heavy robes designed to protect them from the Martian winds, the Hadesian troops were naked, their mortal flesh exposed to the merciless elements. Another difference was that there was no unity of design among the heretic constructs. Each was different from the other, clearly born from a human template but with all manners of dark tech augmentation welded onto it. Arms and legs had been replaced by weapons, pistons, and wheels, eyes torn from their sockets and replaced with many-faceted optics that gleamed with eldritch light, and their flesh was pale and crossed with black veins. They came in as a tide, but there was a sense of purpose and blasphemous order to them. They didn't get in each other way, but moved with perfect synchronization instead. This similarity to the Skitarii's own unity of purpose and motion made their abomination all the more sickening. Rax 99 could hear something, a monstrous signal coursing across the noosphere, running from one tech abomination to another in an unceasing chorus. She closed her receptors to that malevolent tune, raising her defenses against noospheric intrusion and sending an order to her cohorts to do the same. The Skitarii's rifles and the Mechanikus' artillery took a heavy toll on the Hadesian horde, slaying hundreds before they were even able to return fire, but they kept on coming, and eventually they did begin to fire back. Plasma, lasers, and less identifiable projectiles flew into the ranks of the Omniscia's army, tearing through hallowed armor and laying low the machine god's brave warriors. With perfect discipline, the macroclade fell back in order, laying more fire into the enemy with every step. The outpost's defenses rained fire upon the tide of subterranean evil, and for a few seconds it seemed to Rax 99's calculations that the Hadesian horde could be stopped through sheer attrition, methodically slaughtered by the holy calculus of war. Then it came. It leapt from behind the enemy lines, flying dozens of meters into the air and landing atop one of the outpost's towers with sickening fluidity. Within seconds, the tower was destroyed, and it moved to the next, and the next. Less than a minute later, the outpost's defenses had fallen silent, and the Hadesian horde resurged, no longer held back by the Mechanicus output of fire. Rax 99 sent a single order across the lines: they were to hold, and make the Hadesian bleed. Part of her was repulsed at the idea of spilling their unholy blood upon the sands of sacred Mars, but needs must. No sooner had she sent that instruction that it left the last tower it had destroyed and leapt into the air again, this time landing right in front of the macroclade. For the first time, Rax 99 saw it with perfect clarity, and couldn't help but think that this new blasphemy against the machine god wanted to be seen. The construct was huge. It was made of a metal like none Rax 99 had ever seen, and in her decades of service to the Adeptus Mechanicus, she had seen many. Her augmetic eyes turned upward, and she saw. A pale torso, branded with an 8-pointed star and stitched with 2 diamond-mouthed cannons. A delicate horn of pure ivory, rising above an eye socket set within a black metallic patch and burning with crimson fire. A roaring, twisting chainsaw attached to an obscenely delicate arm. A sword held in a scarred hand, its blade burnt black by a fire that would, if given the chance, consume all that was true and pure among the stars. Data flowed into Rax 99's mind, fed into the manifold from the collective's own data archives. Soul Grinder, it told her. One of the ruinous power's greatest blasphemies against the machine god, surpassed only by the dread Chaos Titans themselves. According to the records, soul grinders were not supposed to be able to move like this one, but there was something spindly about this one, like it was only half finished, letting more of its core infernal essence seep through the unholy metal components that had been hammered into its warp-born flesh. It spoke, and its voice was like nails drawn on her very soul. Her vision swam as her optics glitched from the intrusion, the sheer violation of the creature's words. "I am Ankari," it said, "and I hunger." Despite herself, Rax 99's noospheric defenses wavered. The slightest trickle of the Hadesian's scrap code signal leaked through, and she heard the words of the unholy chorus booming into her skull. Plus, we are the united. We are many. We are one. Join us. Join us. Join us. Plus. With a tremendous effort of will, she purged her databanks from the infection before it could spread, triggering an overheating of the part of her own augmented brain that had received the signal. The world around her blacked out for a few seconds as she did so, and when her conscience rebooted, it was to find that the Mechanicu's lines had been broken. The Soul Grinder and the United, for that was what they were, she remembered that much from the communication if nothing else, were sweeping over the Skitarii. Her soldiers were fighting back with the lack of fear typical of their kind, ready to lay low their lives in sacrifice to the Omnissiah, but it wouldn't be enough. Worse, she saw some of them being pulled down, their weapons kicked from their hands, and needle-like apparatus being brought down into their circuits. She heard them scream over the noosphere, and she heard those screams transmute from raw agony into the same signal she had burned 5% of her brain to forget. Cold realization flowed through her mind, and she sent one last signal to her soldiers to shut down their noospheric ports completely, to sever themselves from the grace of the machine god that flowed through the sacred communion of soldier and priest, lest it be perverted to the use of the Heretex. Though they were now alone within their own minds, the Skitarii still fought bravely. Officers shouted their orders aloud in binary, resorting to the more primitive method of communication, but it wasn't enough. Led by the Soul Grinder, the United were slaughtering them by the hundred. As she fired her weapon into the face of something with 8 silvery limbs and a mouth of iron teeth, a horrifying thought struck Rax 99 like a thunderbolt. Immediately, that fear crystallized into reality as she saw several dozens of United swarm the emissary of the collective. Many were obliterated by the sarcophagus defenses, but more and more kept coming. Retreat was impossible, if nothing else. The Soul Grinder had already proven to be more mobile than the emissary's massive bulk could ever hope to be. They wanted to infect the emissary. They wanted to spread their unity to one of the cult Mechanicus' most holy and elevated scions. Rax 99 could not allow that to happen. The very notion of these techno-abominations perverting the emissary was already bad enough, but if they managed to use their blessed connections to the rest of the collective. Even if the collective's noospheric defenses managed to fight them off, which Rax 99 was certain they eventually would, the invisible confrontation could unleash unspeakable destruction across the entire Red Planet. Noospheric warfare was one of the most dangerous forms of conflicts to the Adeptus Mechanicus, and nowhere was it more so than here, on sacred Mars. Overriding her interdiction protocols, she drew her arc pistol and aimed it straight at the emissary, forcing the weapon into overload. She wasn't sure even this would be enough to pierce through the emissary's armor, but it seemed that the member of the collective had seen her and understood her intent, for the sarcophagus shields flickered off, and the heavy metal plates began to slide open. Before any of the United could take advantage of the opening, or notice her and stop her, Rax 99 opened fire. The bolt of azure energy burst from her gun, shattering it in her grasp, and struck true. The emissary's systems were overloaded, and as the entire sarcophagus detonated in a sphere of bright light, she realized that the emissary must have set the entire thing to self-destruct, and her shot had merely accelerated the process. Something slammed into her back, and she was brought to her knees. She reached for her blade, but her arm was suddenly severed at the shoulder by something that resembled an industrial saw. She forced herself back up and punched the United that had cut off her right arm with her left fist, sending it to the ground. Before she could do anything more, the soul grinder was on her, pinning her to the ground with its monstrous mechanical limbs. It leered at her. An admirable effort. But you will pay for that, little one. You could have been granted unity, but for this, you will suffer. We stand for Mars, she said as the monsters circled around her. Her mechanical voice was flat, utterly lacking in panic. It did not betray the horror she felt, both in her meat brain and in her cogitators. She could hear the United slaughter or convert the last of the macroclade, hear the transports retreating at full speed, carrying the handful of survivors north. Hopefully they would bring warning ahead of the horde. Rax 99's thoughts were interrupted when the soul grinder buried one of its talons into her chest. She spasmed as the pain overwhelmed her suppressors, but did not cry out. Enkari cocked its head, grimacing in hatred and spite. So you do, it acknowledged. And now, you will die for it. It took Rax 99 several minutes to die. As Enkari, who had once been a keeper of secrets, but had broken its oaths to the Dark Prince to be reborn as a soul grinder under the hands of the Masters of the Forge of Souls, had promised, she did pay for her defiance of the Slaaneshi Hadesian kingdom known to itself and its neighboring powers as the United. Did she regret, in those final, agonizing moments, that she had used her last shot on the emissary and not on herself? Only the motive force knew. The United set forth, marching, rolling, and clawing their way north, where Olympus Mons stood, and where, in its depths, the Martian collective, which was linked to every servant of the machine god in the entire Sol system, awaited. Violators. They had always been monsters. Not for them the ancient legacy, despoiled by treachery and the machinations of a cruel fate. Not for them the loss of innocence and honor, the fall from grace that had cast the angel and his sons into the abyss. They had been raised to demigodhood in hell, and it was hell that coursed through their mutated flesh and tattered souls. They were of the angel's blood, created by one of his sons during the War of Woe. He had taken the children of 100 daemon worlds and infused them with the strength of dead angels, hoping to raise new brothers to replace the ones he had lost. But when he had opened the sarcophagus of the first, that apothecary, who had taken part in the purges of Istvan III and the slaughter of Istvan V, before following the Legion in its ravenous crusade across the Imperium and the madness of Terra, had been horrified. For these young Astaroths did not possess the glamour, and embraced the truth of what they were, displaying its awfulness for all to see. With a pale, corpse-like face and blood-red lips that peeled back to reveal vampiric fangs, the first of the apothecary's creations looked back at his maker and knew only hunger. He had tried to kill them, but by then it had been too late. They had risen from their sarcophagi, their eyes burning with the thirst, and their father and his helpers had been the first to feel their fangs. Then they taken the weapons and armor that had been meant for them, and with those they had made war upon the Eye of Terror. They had been monstrous in ways few could match, even among the traitor legions who had claimed the Eye as their home in exile. They had made no pretense of honor, neither given or asked any quarters, and what prisoners they took they made sport of before devouring them once their amusement passed. They attacked any and every one, uncaring for the pacts and alliances that bound the principates of the Eye, tenuous as those ever were. Even as the War of Woe accelerated toward the final confrontation between Sanguinius and Dorn on the Crone world of Idris, they raided outposts of the 7th and 9th Legions both. Not even the Raven Guard, feared across the Eye for their eldritch powers, were beyond their depredations, and though they suffered greatly for every slight against the Raven Lord's get, they did not hesitate to strike again. And so they had been named Violators by those who fought them, the mad children born of the coupling of the Eye and Sanguinius' tainted blood. A warband, but one without lord, without hierarchy, without law but that of, do as you will. Their ranks had swelled with warriors from all 8 of the Eye's bloodlines as fresh recruits broke with the teachings their forebears tried to impose upon them, rejecting a past they had never known and grudges they cared nothing for, and embracing the dark majesty of the now instead. Born to the Eye's timeless tides, for them there was no past, no future, only the joy of savagery and cruelty. Even those who hailed from other gene lines were transformed over time, losing the traits of their parent legion and receiving the curse of the thirst thanks to the debased rituals and celebrations of the violators. They were marked by the youngest god, avatars of the unending lusts and appetites that are the true nature of Slaanesh, past the beautiful masks and the drug-hazed lies. They were selfishness and excess incarnate and unrestrained, and the legions regarded them with naught but hatred and contempt. For millennia afterwards, the violators had continued their depredations. They had raided the holdings of the traitor legions, the dark mechanicum and the lost and the damned, sating their thirst on the blood of the other slaves of ruin. More akin to some unnatural disaster than an organized force, they had rampaged unchecked, and in their wake had trailed hosts of daemons and lesser followers of the Dark Prince, hoping to pick at the carcasses they left behind. Though they originated from sanguineous blood, not once had Azkaelin called upon them to join the defense of the Angel's Palace when the Shadowed Wars came upon the Harbinger Star. This may be because the Angel's loyal guardian was disgusted with them, but more likely it was because every emissary who had ever been sent to the Violators had been eaten alive, no matter who had sent them. There had been attempts to destroy them. The Imperial Fists had gathered a host of their enslaved mortal armies and allied Chaos Knights to break the Violators upon the ashen plains surrounding the Grave of Spring, following the sinking of the suspended city into the lakes of lava boiling beneath. One of the Salamander's lords had spent a century hunting them down after they pillaged one of the infernal Forge worlds under his protection. Outside the Eye of Terror, for the Violators had found ways to slip past the Iron Cage on occasion, the Iron Warriors had thought them annihilated 3 times, always at the end of long and costly campaigns whose human survivors more often than not had needed the Emperor's peace afterwards. The Farseers of Craftworld Ulthwe had, at Eldrad Ulthran's direction, broken the warbands back on 2 separate occasions, ambushing them as they emerged from the Eye of Terror and inflicting tremendous losses upon them. Yet always some of the Violators had survived, and their monstrous banner been raised anew. Those who studied the lore of Ruin whispered that they were beloved of Slaanesh, and that their evil would not be allowed to die out before the Lord of Pain and Pleasure willed it so. So it went, for thousands of years, the Violators' dreadful reputation growing even as their numbers waxed and waned. Then, as the times of ending loomed and the Eye of Terror echoed with the call to join the Black Legion in its preparations to break Kadiah once and for all, the Violators were visited by a golden angel. The Sanguineur, that mysterious creature with unclear ties to the Ninth Legion, came to the Violators accompanied by an escort of blood angels. Immediately, the mad children attacked the intruders, slaughtering the Sanguineur's escort but failing to put down the Sanguineur itself. Perhaps something in them recognized the Herald's power and compelled them to at least heed its words, but more likely, it was the 13 champions the Sanguineur turned into corpses in single combat that persuaded them to listen. The Sanguineur spoke to the Violators in the ancient tongue of Baal, the long-destroyed home world of the Blood Angels, whose words flowed through the warband's blood as surely as the thirst. It spoke to them of a great war on the horizon, of the promise of plunder and revelry such as had not been since the Roboutian Heresy itself. It spoke of the devastation the Violators would wreak if they joined this grand endeavor, appealing to their monstrous nature. It spoke of blood old and new, spilled in such quantities that even they would be sated for a time. Spellbound by the Sanguineur's words, more and more Violators gathered, some leaving their ships to go aboard the one where the Golden Angel spoke, others listening in over infernal voxcasters. For 6 full days the Sanguineur spoke, until at last it ceased its tale and asked the Violators a simple question: would they join this great battle, or turn away from it? As one, the Violators howled their answer, and it seemed as if the golden mask of the Sanguineur twisted into a smile. It walked among them, and they drank deeply from its ever-filled cup. Around the warband's fleet, the Eye of Terror pulsed in response to their hunger and approval, and the bargain between the Herald of Sanguinius and the nightmarish entity that was the Violators' collective soul was sealed. The tides of the warp surged, enveloping the fleet, and when they withdrew the Violators had vanished, displaced across time and space to deliver them to the battle that had been promised to them. And so did the Violators came to Sol, to play their part in the Angel War. The skies above Terra burned and screamed as the Chaos ships burst forth from the warp, brought across the galaxy and far beyond the Mandeville Point by the Sanguineur's malevolent will. Orbital platforms broke apart and plummeted toward the Earth under the sudden gravitic shift, and the kilometer-long ships crashed onto the sprawling hives of Terra. Within mere seconds, millions were incinerated or crushed to death as the ships of the Violators fell, like spears thrown from the heavens by a cruel god. Yet they did not detonate, for such was not the sanguinaire's will, and in that moment the laws of physics that ruled the Materium held little sway over the wrecks of the Violators' dreaded fleet. As the confusion from Light's End and the other events preluding the Angel War was added to by this sudden attack, the Violators themselves emerged from the ruins of their ships, caring nothing for their loss. For there, amidst the devastation, standing tall and proud and shielded by heavy-duty void shields that had been activated the moment the Warband's flotilla had appeared, was their target. The Hall of Judgment, from where the Grand Provost Marshal enforced the Lex Imperialis as head of the Adeptus Arbits. The center of the galaxy-spanning juggernaut that, from the chambers of the Imperial Senate to the farthest outpost of the Imperium, enforced the law of the Emperor. It was a monument of order, a symbol of the Imperium's control over the stars, and to the Violators, it was an abomination they hungered to destroy more than they had ever desired anything else in their twisted existences. As the earth shook and spires toppled, the hall remained standing firm, its deep foundations proof against the devastation unleashed around it. Hundreds of Violators ran madly among the burning ruins, driven by the leash the Sanguinaire had woven around their souls. Salvaged tanks and transports emerged from the bays of the fallen ships, and raptors flew in the air on jump packs that ran on pain rather than fuel. A monstrous shriek rose from the Violators' host. It was not a war cry, for such things were for armies, or even hordes that possessed at least a modicum of unity. But the only thing that kept the Violators together as they charged the Hall of Judgment, the only thing that had kept the Warband functional since its blood-drenched birth in the gene mills of their murdered creator, was raw, malevolent hunger. A hunger to destroy, to rend, and tear down all that stood between them and their immediate desires. The vile, mad, true sons of Sanguinius' accursed blood screamed, and Terra shivered in remembrance of the last time such screams had been heard on its surface. Watchers. 000.M42. Light's End. It was not a temple. Oh, it had some of the traits of one, to be sure. Someone who did not know this place's purpose or history could be forgiven for thinking it one, though its wardens would not look kindly upon such a mistake. They would look upon the pillars engraved with names, on the thousands and thousands of candles glowing in the tunnels, on the lifelike gisants that depicted so many of the Emperor's warriors in their final repose, and they would believe it to be a temple, a crypt, where the Emperor's loyal servants could finally rest and know peace. But it was not a temple. It was a memorial, built to honor warriors who had given their lives in service of a dream none of them had lived to see spread across the stars. It had been constructed when that dream had first blossomed, when the Great Crusade had left Terra to bring peace and order to the scattered pockets of humanity across the Sol system, and then, to the rest of the galaxy. As the Emperor's legions liberated the system that had birthed their species, the Master of Mankind had commanded those who bore the numeral 17 on their armor, and given them special instructions. It was said, in the records of these chosen's distant descendants, that he had pointed at the sky, and bade them to bring his fallen warriors there, to rest for all eternity amidst the stars for which they had given their lives. So had been created the Shrine of Unity. The Imperial Heralds, who in time would become the Word-bearers, had been built within a comet whose elliptical orbit brought it within the solar system every few years. The bodies of the Thunder Warriors and Space Marines who had perished in the Unification Wars had been carried across the void and laid to rest within the catacombs whose digging the legionaries had directed themselves. By decree of the Emperor himself, 100 Imperial Heralds had been attached to the Shrine of Unity, to care for and defend it. When Lorgar had been found and the Imperial Heralds had become the Word-bearers, that duty had remained, and when the Urizen had traveled to Terra, he had visited his sons and honored them for their work. In the 10,000 years since, the vigil had continued. Assignment to the Shrine of Unity was seen as an honor among the Word-bearers, and there was a rotation where those who distinguished themselves on the field being sent to Sol to relieve one of the 100 Space Marines keeping watch over the remains of the Imperium's ancient heroes. Beyond guarding and maintaining the shrine, the Watchers, as they called themselves, were also responsible for guiding Imperial scholars who, for one reason or another, required access to the catacombs and the priceless, irreplaceable records of the Unification Wars laid alongside the fallen warriors. Over time, they had accumulated other duties as well. They had been called upon to arbitrate disputes between imperial factions, none daring to contest their neutrality. They had used their small flotilla to journey across the neighboring systems and help enforce the Emperor's peace there. The legendarily insular Adeptus Custodes had closer ties with the Watchers than with virtually any other Space Marine force across the galaxy, for while the Custodes were both greater warriors and more skilled diplomats, the sheer intimidating factor of their presence meant that sometimes, it was better to send a party of less terrifying, but still transhuman, word-bearers. Only twice had that vigil been interrupted. First, when the fires of Guilliman's heresy had reached the shores of Sol, and all warriors had been called to defend the walls of the imperial palace. The shrine had been left untended then, as its guardians, reduced from 100 to 79 by the echoes of the war that had reached the throne world ahead of the arch-traitors' armies, journeyed to Terra to add their blades and bolters to its defenses. Warned by Magnus that the renegades could make use of the shrine's symbolic status in their vile sorceries, Perturabo had used artifacts from the Dark Age of technology to speed up the comet's path, sending it away from the Sol System's plane, where it would be useless to the traitors' plans. It had worked, and the shrine had been left alone, returning to Sol after the carnage of the siege of Terra had ended and the traitor legions had been put to flight. Before departing to join the Scouring, where he would eventually vanish while facing the champions of the Dark Gods on Kur, Lorgar had visited the shrine one more time, and wept for all that had been lost, and all that would now never be. The second occurrence had happened during the 36th millennium, in those dark days known to chroniclers as the Reign of Blood. When Goj Vandir overthrew the Ecclesiarch and added his throne to his own as master of the Administratum, the Watchers had become wary. Like all sons of Lorgar, they had a healthy contempt for the imperial creed, but Vandir's proclamations that he intended to purge the corruption from the God Emperor's church were judged worthy of at least listening to the man. When the new Ecclesiarch sent emissaries to the Shrine of Unity to explain his plans in detail and ask for the Watchers' support, they were received. But it had been a trap. Vandir was wisely fearful of the word-bearers, even more so than he was of the Custodes, whose influence had in those days been much diminished and was now restrained to the security of the imperial palace. His emissaries were assassins, who used suicide bombs during the meeting to decapitate the Watchers before drowning the shrine in fanatic Frateris Templars. The Watchers had fought long and hard, but eventually they had all perished, except for a few, who had been on a secret mission elsewhere in the Segmentum. Upon their return to Sol, these warriors had discovered the fate of their brothers, and had eventually proven vital to the Inquisition's efforts to warn the rest of the Space Marines' legions of Vandir's atrocities. In the wake of the Reign of Blood, the Shrine of Unity had been reclaimed by the 17th Legion, and its defenses increased tenfold. The bodies of the slain Watchers had been buried with full honor. No one spoke of what had been done to the remains of the thousands of Frateris Templars they had killed before being dragged down and slain, and the vigil had resumed. And if Sebastian Thor's successors had looked up from their palaces and shivered at the thought of what was out there, watching, well, so long as that thought had helped keep them honest, the Watchers would have been satisfied. The centuries had passed, and turned into millennia. Generations of word-bearers had come and gone, protecting the Shrine of Unity and keeping watch over the heart and soul of the Imperium. And now, at the turning of the millennium, things were going to change once more. By now, every single one of the 8-7 Watchers on station in the shrine had heard the news of Lorgar's return. It had taken a considerable effort of will for Captain Sor Faras, the officer in command of the Watchers, not to go straight to his primarch. Only the knowledge that his duty remained the same, that if the Urizen needed him and his brothers, he would have called for them, had kept him in place. Still, there was no denying the exuberance that had spread across the ranks. On its own, Lorgar's return after 10,000 years of absence would have been enough to shake the Imperium to its foundations. But the Urizen hadn't been alone. Magnus the Red, long thought to be all but dead, had also returned, having awakened in time to thwart a black crusade aimed at Terathelion. The Crimson King had arrived in Sol soon after the Watchers had received confirmation of Lorgar's sudden presence on Luna. Sor Faras wanted to join the Primarches. By the Emperor, he wanted it, more than he had ever wanted anything else in his 5 centuries of life. But his duty kept him in check. It did little for his temper, however, which was why the other Watchers, who had to be feeling the same desire as their captain, had been very, very careful around him for the last few days. None of them had been foolish enough to ask if they could go to Terra, or Mars, as it seemed the 2 Primarches had gone there after meeting up, as representatives of the Watchers and the Legion. As it turned out, Sor Faras had been right to keep his forces concentrated on the shrine, though he would never have imagined what was happening across Sol, not even in his worst nightmares. By chance or destiny, the Shrine of Unity had returned to the Sol system just in time for the turning of the millennium and the Primarcha's return. Its elliptical orbit had been forever altered by what Perturabo had done to keep it out of the system during the Siege of Terra, becoming much wider than it had before. It could still be seen from Terra when it returned into the solar plane, but only using a telescope. There probably was a metaphor in there, Sor Feroz knew, but now was hardly the time to think about it. As a result of that altered orbit, the comet was currently somewhere in what was known as the outer worlds of the Sol system. The shrine was beyond the orbit of Uranus, which was currently the closest of the system's worlds. Yet even from that distance, the shrine's many aspects and relay networks gave the watchers a view of the events unfolding across the system. Sor Feroz stood in the command station, a vast, reinforced bunker built on the outer shell of the comet. Surrounded by Vox officers and tech priests, with a squad of his brothers keeping guard, the captain of the Watchers grimly listened as the list of disasters grew and grew. So far, there were multiple etheric manifestations all across the system, with 4 different traces on Holy Terra itself. There were signs of battle on Mars' surface, as one of the infernal kingdoms had broken free of the Hades. An unidentified Chaos ship had appeared near Titan and was sailing directly toward the moon, shrugging off all fire directed its way. Pluto. Pluto was gone, there would be no reclaiming the frozen world, of that Sor Feroz was grimly certain, though the full extent of the threat on that front was difficult to evaluate due to the lack of information they possessed. Given that they had needed to kill an entire choir of astropaths who had been lost to whatever madness was pouring out of Sol's outermost world, that threat was unlikely to be small. Abnormal gravitic readings in the outer system. On screen, ordered Sor Feroz. The main display of the command center shifted, displaying a representation of the void between the shrine and Pluto. With Neptune on the other side of Sol, there was an immense region of the system left empty save for the scattered void fortresses and other outposts. Numbers ran alongside the display, and though the captain of the Watchers wasn't well versed into the mysteries of the Omnis Saya, he knew enough to realize the cosmic magnitude of the energies being unleashed within this apparently empty quadrant. Then, all of a sudden, where there had been nothing, there was a fleet. The void crackled with arcane energies, and thousands of vessels manifested as if conjured from the blackness of space itself. Each of them was unique, yet they all shared the same alien sense of design. Their hulls were made of some organic-seeming material, painted in a violent riot of colors and twisted into shapes that reminded Sor Feroz of immense, mutated sea creatures. They gleamed in the light of Sol, the reflection hurting Sor Feroz's eyes even through the screens, and the few Vox relay stations that had survived the gravitic shift of the fleet's arrival were obliterated in seconds by torrents of greenish energy. At the center of this Xenos armada was an enormous engine, spherical and hundreds of kilometers wide, its surface bristling with unknown devices that were no doubt weapons of some sort. The cogitators chugged to put together a complete picture of this immense engine, combining imagery gleaned from 100 different point of views, and a 3-dimensional model of the sphere was projected on one of the hololiths. The moon-sized ship had an immense pit on its equator, whose depth the Auspex couldn't evaluate. All attempts at scanning the pit's contents returned only a cascade of errors. Cold realization dawned on Sor Feroz. By teleporting so deep within the Sol system, this fleet had completely bypassed the defenses of the system's halo belt. Thousands of star forts, manned by imperial regiments and empirically anchored to the arrival points of the warp routes leading to and from Sol, all made entirely useless. There were other defenses deeper in the system, of course, but the vast majority of the efforts made to turn Sol into an unconquerable fortress had been located at its borders. The sheer size of an entire solar system made truly securing it a fool's errand otherwise. The orbital defenses of every world in the solar system had been designed by the warsmiths of the 4th Legion, working with the nigh-limitless resources of the Imperium and the knowledge of the Adeptus Mechanicus. But even they had limits, and it had been thousands of years since they had been truly tested. A groan of pain drew his attention away from the display. Next to him stood Brother Belagosa, leader of the librarians attached to the Watchers. Belagosa and his psychic brethren had been the ones to confirm Lorgar's return, and they were also the ones who were suffering the most from what was occurring across Sol. Sor Feroz had ordered the rest of the librarians to isolate within their warded chambers, but he needed Belegas's own insight into what was happening. He wondered now if that decision hadn't been a mistake. "I can hear them," groaned the librarian, using his staff as support to stay on his feet, sweat running on his face. "Aboard these ships, they are singing? Their psychic presence is abhorrent, brother Captain." "Hold on, brother," urged Sor Faros. "The Emperor needs your service, now more than ever." Despite the immense pain he must be feeling to let it show, Belegosa managed a weak smile and nodded. Neither of them mentioned that the two word-bearers behind him had their bolters drawn. They both knew why such precautions were necessary, but there was no need to speak it aloud. "The cogitators have answered our queries, Captain," called out one of the human officers. "The technology of these ships resemble that of a Xenos species encountered by the Third Legion during the Great Crusade, the Laters. But according to the records, the Laters were completely wiped out at the order of the Primarch Fulgrim, and even before that, their space technology was limited to a handful of in-system crafts. Records indicate that the Primarch's decision was made after the Thousand Sons attached to his legion discovered that the Laters had been corrupted by the warp." Sor Faros' mind flashed back to the astropathic communications they had received not so long ago, the terrible news coming from Chemos, announcing that the Emperor's children's home world was besieged by the Black Legion. The news had been heavily suppressed across Sol, just like the next set of messages, sent by the reinforcements that had arrived to Chemos only to find it in ruins and the Black Legion gone. It didn't seem like a coincidence that the Laters would reappear now, after those who had supposedly exterminated them had been cast down by the Clone Lord's Bastard Legion. The officer visibly swallowed as he continued, "And we also have a hit for the gravitic displacement accompanying their teleportation inside the system, my lord. The Auspex registered a similar phenomenon once before." "When?" urged Sor Faros. I don't know, my lord. The timestamp is from early M32, with the attached words, "During the beast's rising, when its grin shone over the throne." Sor Faros' blood ran cold. The officer might not know what those words referred to, but he certainly did. The War of the Beast was not the Imperium's proudest moment, and knowledge of how close they had all come to utter ruin had been quietly suppressed over the millennia. Even among the legions, details were scarce, but Sor Faros was the master of the Shrine of Unity, and had spent many a night reading through its vast archives. He knew of the teleportation technology the Orcs had used during the War of the Beast, of how it had allowed them to deploy many of their own war moons across the galaxy, including one in Terra's own orbit. The same archives claimed that the Mechanikus had recovered some of that technology in the wake of the war's end, but that it had ultimately been judged too dangerous and unstable to adapt for the Imperium's use. Sor Faros was willing to believe that, given what he knew of Orcs and their so-called technology. But the Beast's forces had been scattered all across the galaxy, they had even targeted Eldarcraft worlds and Exodite planets. It was possible that other factions could have recovered pieces of their teleportation technology. And if the Laters had survived the Third Legion's purge? How long had the foul Xenos been planning this attack? "I see," said Belegosa suddenly. Sor Faros turned sharply to look at the librarian. His brother now stood utterly still, eyes wide open as he looked at something far beyond the confines of the command center. "They are here," he said, his voice utterly empty of any emotion. 6 and 6, the unholy numerology of ruin. A ritual writ across the void, an offering, and a promise all in one. He calls, and they have answered. By 6 and 6 they come, and the gates, the gates. The librarian violently threw his head back and screamed, bloody tears streaking on his face. The gates of the Silver Palace are open wide. The Harbinger star is sundered. They are coming. They are coming. Somewhere in the command center, a chronometer that had been wrought within the halls of Olympus Mons and designed to be precise to the trillionth of second ticked, marking the 6th minute since the turning of the millennium. Sor Faros was no psyker, but he still felt it. There was not a soul across all of Sol who did not, even the Culexus of the Officio Assassinorum and the pariah agents of the Inquisition felt it, rippling over their empty souls. The void burned and split. Like skin being ripped apart, a great tear appeared in the blackness of space, spreading from Terra to Pluto and cutting the Sol system in twain. From the point of view of the Shrine of Unity, Uranus simply vanished, swept behind the curtain of madness and ruin. There were screams, in the command center and beyond it. Sor Faraz felt the terrible weight of the rift press on his mind, right through the wards, crafted by the 15th Legion in another age, that were supposed to shield the shrine from the influence of the warp. He fought against it, refusing to give in. Around him, mortals wailed and fell on the floor, clawing at their flesh. He drew strength from the sight, those were his people, sworn to follow him just like he was sworn to lead them. Hold fast! He roared, slamming his sword into the floor. He had not even realized he had drawn it. Stand firm, servants of the Emperor. This sorcery shall not vanquish us. Hold fast, in the name of Terra and your duty. Slowly, order returned to the command center. The pressure didn't stop, but men and women forced themselves to their feet, ignoring the pain they felt in their very souls with a determination that made Sor Faraz's heart fill with pride, despite the grimness of the situation. Not all of them managed it. Some were already dead, having succumbed to shock, while others had to be put down by security forces before they could hurt themselves or others. Initiate all quarantine protocols, Sor Faraz commanded. Filter all input through the secondary cogitators before letting the data into our main systems. The pain was starting to diminish now, in a way not dissimilar to how a cut's initial spike of pain would fade and be replaced with a lesser, continuous pain until it was healed. As the screens resumed activity, displaying an image of the warp rift that had cut Sol in two, Sor Faraz didn't think that particular wound would ever fully heal. The warp rift could not be properly measured, but the position of other objects in the system relative to it could, though that required to consider the rift as a vertical plane, which wasn't true even by a long shot. The latter fleet was on the same side of it as the Shrine of Unity. They could also still see Mars, but their view of the inner worlds of Sol was almost completely obscured as the rift splintered down its end, seeming to reach toward the planets like the tendrils of a hungry predator. Something is happening in the latter fleet, called out a different officer from the one who had presented the cogitator's analysis to Sor Faraz. The main screen switched to a live feed of the latter's flagship, the enormous, moon-sized vessel. The pit on its equatorial belt was truly immense, and a baleful light emanated from its depths. A tendril of the warp rift was reaching inside it, and as Sor Faraz watched, he saw a bright, eldritch light emerge from that pit and flow up the rift, before speeding all the way to Holy Terra. Part of the word-bearer captain knew that this was impossible, that the laws of physics and the speed at which light traveled meant that even if whatever that light had been able to cross the distance between the artificial moon and Terra, he shouldn't have been able to see it. But this was the stuff of the warp, and the laws of the materium held no sway over it. More bursts of light emerged from the pit. They were lesser than the first one, but there were hundreds of them, and they were all aimed at Terra. Bloody tears ran down Belegas's face. The two word-bearers assigned to watching over him had their bolters aimed straight at him now, but they hadn't fired, not yet. The stolen sons, he babbled incoherently, twitching in agony as he clutched to his power staff. The stolen sons, returned from the pits of torment and brought to the throne once more. Unholy symmetry, a pattern of ruin woven from their pain. The tithe is owed, the tithe was claimed. Belegosa, Sor Faraz ordered harshly, take a hold of yourself. Raise your mental defenses and shut yourself off the warp. Do it, now. For a moment, nothing happened, and the captain worried that he was going to have to order his librarian brother executed. But, slowly, Belegas's twitching diminished, and the frost that had spread around his feet melted away. Sor Faraz managed to catch Belegosa as he collapsed, exhausted beyond even the endurance of a space marine. The captain handed over the librarian's unconscious body to his minders, ordering them to bring him to the apothecarian at once. His focus returned on the displays. They were still centered on the warp rift, which pulsated with energy like an infected wound seen through infrared. Tendrils of warp energy spread from it, worming their way through space and toward inhabited worlds and moons at impossible speeds. One display shifted briefly to the pick feed of a station on the path of one such tendril, and Sor Faraz saw the true face of the enemy. These tendrils weren't made of warp energy, after all. They were daemons. Thousands of daemons, rushing down paths of broken stone stretching from the immaterium and into the Sol system. In the seconds before the display went dark, its data feed corrupted, the word-bearer captain recognized the spawn of the dark god Slaanesh, dark prince of pain and pleasure. And there were so many of these roads, each the size of cities. His mind boggled as he tried to comprehend how many daemons had entered Seoul. Billions, at the very least. How could so many manifest at once, especially here, so close to the Astronomicon? A terrible thought crept into his mind, and he quashed it ruthlessly before it could even express itself into. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The very notion was treachery. "The latter fleet is advancing," called out someone, their voice admirably firm. "We are detecting more gravitic shifts on the capital ship. The Magi's theory is that they are teleporting troops across the system." The officer, a woman with the markings of a lieutenant on her uniform, turned toward Sor Faras, and the captain saw the fear in her eyes, despite her control. "Captain, what are your orders?" A space marine knew no fear. The capacity for it was removed during the excruciating process that turned an aspirant into a legionary. But in that moment, faced with the greatest threat to Seoul since the heresy itself, faced with the terrible possibility that had, however briefly, raised within his own soul, Captain Sor Faras of the Word-Bearers felt something very much akin to terror. It only lasted for a moment. His training and his oaths reasserted themselves, and he shook himself free of his torpor, scowling at himself for having wasted even a few seconds on such weakness. "We fight. We fight until we can fight no longer, and then we keep fighting." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "All hands to the ships," he ordered. "Full battle readiness. Empty the shrine and activate the automated defenses. Someone get me the Lord High Admiral on the Vox. We must not let this fleet reach Terra." The Solar Fleet was a powerful force, an entire battle fleet by the standards of the Imperial Navy, dedicated entirely to the protection of Seoul, with occasional forays into its neighboring systems. Almost every ship of it had been called back for the turning of the millennium, and for all that Sor Faras was grateful for it now, he couldn't help wondering if someone somewhere hadn't known something he had not. And yet, just like the other defenses, it had been a long time since the Solar Fleet had seen battle. There were persistent rumors that assignment to the Throne World's elite defenders had become something of a token of prestige in the Imperial Navy, each position something to be bargained for in the political circles of the Navy's imperialist elite. The constant drills and maneuvering exercises should have kept the skills of everyone aboard the Solar Fleet in top condition at least, but Sor Faras knew all too well just how different real battle was from training, and this was going to be a battle like no other since the heresy itself. The latter fleet outnumbered the Solar Fleet significantly, and the Imperials didn't have anything like the moonship of the warp-spawn Xenos. If one counted all the civilian vessels, then the calculus was different, but most of these would be utterly useless except to make the enemy waste their ammunition, if their weapons even used ammunition as the Imperials understood it. The handful of Legion vessels the Watchers would bring to the fray, while nothing to scoff at, were only a drop in the ocean. But there were other ships in the system that would answer the call to defend it. The great gathering for the turning of the millennium had brought thousands of ships to Seoul, and the troop transports had not come without escort. Rogue traders and inquisitors, sisters of battle, cardinals, and governors, all had come to Terra, and brought their ships with them. Ordering this disparate assembly into something resembling an order of battle would not be easy, yet surely if one soul in the Imperium could do it, it would be the Lord High Admiral. One did not become a High Lord of Terra by being incompetent. The sheer ruthlessness of Terran high politics meant that any weakness would result in one's downfall. Even then, going purely by the numbers, death seemed the most likely outcome. And, far worse, so was defeat. But Sor Faras knew that he was no master of void warfare. The Lord Admiral might see a way to turn this around. "And we have Lorgar," he told himself. "The Primarch has returned. We will not fail, not now that the miracle our Legion hoped for has arrived at last." Check the description for the links to the author.